Good afternoon and welcome to this annual workshop of the Regulatory Science Network in the Netherlands. As you may know, and probably that's the reason why you are here today, the Regulatory Science Network Netherlands, RSNN, is an organization which is built on three pillars. And the three partners in the organization are the regulators. So we have representatives of the Dutch and also the European regulators in our organization. We have the second partner is the academia, and academia is represented in the network by the University of Utrecht and the University of Groningen. And the third partner is the industry. And I am representing the industry today. My name is Sjaak. I am Senior Advisor Global Regulatory Affairs for Janssen. And I'm happy to be your host and your chairman today. Before we start with the program, I'd like to share with you a few welcoming words, of course, but also some practical instructions. So first of all, I guess you know that there is a pandemic around us, which of course impacts the meeting of today. Anyway, we are very pleased to have a physical presence today, and I think there are like 30 or 40 people here in this room, which is of course less than we hoped for initially. But we do have a live stream which is running 30 seconds behind, so keep that in mind if they ask a question. And the live stream will probably host like 60 or 70 people, which makes it still a very nice audience for these type of meetings in this given period. Another consequence of the pandemic is that we have two apologies on the speakers list. First of all, Marion Pasmoy, who was planned to lead the panel session, is unfortunately not present because she has a little bit of flu symptoms, which of course she felt it would be better to stay at home, and I guess she's with us in the live stream this afternoon. The other apology has nothing to do with COVID, well, maybe indirectly, but I don't know. Could well be. But Sabine Strauss, chairman of the PRAC, the Pharmacovigilance Committee of EMA, she has an ad hoc PRAC meeting actually today, which of course she has to give priority to. So unfortunately, she cannot introduce the topic for us this afternoon, and she will not join the panel later this afternoon. But hopefully the PRAC will come under her leadership to a right decision. Next consequence is that a few of our speakers will not be physically here. We're still pleased to have the majority of the speakers here on the stage, but a few speakers, and I will introduce them later, will join us by the live stream. So you will see them and can discuss with them over the live stream. But that's live today in this period of the pandemic. During the presentations and during the panel discussion, the chat is open for people on the live stream. So throughout the entire meeting, you can post your questions and ask them either to a speaker while they are presenting, and I will then host the Q&A session in between two speakers, and during the panel leader will do that. So that is also covered for those in the room. You can ask questions after each speaker, and I will give the opportunity, which is the usual process. We will have a break. You have the program in your booklet. That break is outside, but we do not have, unfortunately, we cannot offer you drinks after the meeting, and of course not a dinner. And that has to do with the COVID regulations for events, which means that by 6 o'clock you all have to be outside. So we will finish about 5:45, then you have to run, get your coat, and make sure you're out in 15 minutes. So if you want to network with one of the other participants, you have to do that outside, I'm afraid. So let's hope next year it will be a bit more comfortable. I think those are the practical instructions and announcements that I wanted to make. So that brings me to the introduction of the topic of this afternoon. And you may have all read that already in your invitation. But the RSNN, the Regulatory Science Network Netherlands, we organize every year a couple of meetings, and they're all around regulatory science and let's say, a critical look at the regulatory framework in the Netherlands and in Europe. And we try to find topics which are of interest for the three partners that I mentioned, and outside that, and see where we can do some further research and improve the system, or at least have a critical look at it, and discuss that with relevant stakeholders. We do that by organizing, first of all, the annual workshop, and this is the one that you are today for 2021. Last year we had a very nice workshop with EMA, but also virtual, and the year before we had a few other meetings as well. On top of the annual workshop, we have smaller sessions, which we call expert meetings, where we invite experts from specific disciplines to discuss in a closed, smaller session on specific topics, and we publish usually white papers or articles after those meetings. They're all posted on the website. So if you're not yet registered as an RSNN follower, please do so. We're quite active on the website and on LinkedIn and other social media. So, and it's all for free of charge. So I think it's a very nice podium to get some information. But today the workshop is about the upstream coordinated, structured and harmonized regulatory framework established at the European level. So I think if I translate it in a very practical example, you are all aware of the CHMP guidelines, the ICH initiatives, and everything in that framework is focused on harmonizing, streamlining, unifying the European Union in its approach to approval of medicines, and not only approval, also the pharmacovigilance around it. So that's very well structured. It's very well set now in our daily life, and it leads to a European approval. That's what we call the upstream convergence. So it is the convergence towards a one single decision. But in reality, what happens after, and let's look specifically at the, let's say, the CHMP or EMA approval. What happens after an approval is very divergent in the member states. And we try to find a few examples which clearly visualize those levels of divergence. So we look at vaccines, where we see, after an EMA approval, a very different interpretation and a very different implementation at the national level. And Hans Schikan, and I will introduce the speakers later, will tell us a bit more about the Dutch perspective about that vaccine strategy and the vaccine distribution in the Netherlands and outside Netherlands. So that is one of the examples. The other example that we will address is the ATMP legislation. ATMPs, you know, the advanced treatment, advanced therapeutic medicinal products, very innovative, very usually small patient populations. The reality is that while there is an ATMP regulation in Europe, you see at different national levels that the use of those ATMPs, the use of those products, is also outside the European approval, and that is what we call hospital exemption, where hospitals make their own product and treat patients in a very valid but very different and divergent way. And Delphi Coppens from the KWF, the Cancer Institute, will speak to us about that example. The third example is health technology assessments. I don't think I need to explain to you that once a product is approved in the Netherlands, the next step is the reimbursement, the health technology assessment, which may lead to an approval or to reimbursement in the Netherlands, but the outcome in other countries could be completely different, or vice versa. So that's a very clear example, I would say, about divergence after a unified approval. And Wim Goettsch of the University of Utrecht and the Zin Institute will speak to us via the live stream because he could not be with us this afternoon for the reasons I mentioned. Then it's interesting, after these three very specific examples, to listen a bit to the views from, well, a little bit outside stakeholders, but very relevant stakeholders. So we're very pleased to have with us Tony Humphreys here in the room, and he will speak on behalf of the EMA about their views, their perspective on the upstream and downstream differences. And I'm very interested to hear his point of view on this specific topic. Then after the break, we will have a look from outside. And it's very interesting to hear the view of a bestuurskundige. I don't know what the right English term is, but he will say that himself. But Bernard Steunenberg is from University of Leiden, and he's looking with a different view to the regulatory framework. And he will make comparisons, I think, between the medicines legislations, but also other legislations that we see in Europe and that are then implemented completely differently across the member states. But what is probably most interesting, because at the end of all these discussions, at the end of all this divergence, there is the patient, right? And we all develop our products and we regulate our products and we reimburse our products and we distribute our products with the aim to ultimately reach the patients and treat the patients and have access to them. So I'm really pleased to have two representatives of patients' organizations here with us this afternoon who will speak about their views towards this divergence and how they view this. And with that, we have covered the speakers for the first part. The second part is a panel discussion, but I'll be back to you when we reach that point in the agenda. So with that, I think we can invite the first speaker to the podium, and that is Hans Schikan. Hans is, I will briefly introduce Hans. Hans is what they call the special envoy for vaccines in the Netherlands on behalf of the Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sport, VWS. So he's advising the Ministry of Health in all kinds of vaccine-related discussions, and he will tell more about that himself. Hans has a background in the industry, was previously the CEO of Prosenza, a young, I should say, biopharmaceutical company in Leiden, and before that he worked at several other companies, including Genzyme, Organon, and he was also in the past chairman of the Dutch Association for the Pharmaceutical Industry, NEPharma. So a very nice background specifically today to look at the strategy behind the distribution and for vaccines. Hans? The floor is yours.
Well, actually, 9 months ago, I was asked to become special envoy for vaccines. And what was the assignment? It really was about, in a short time span, to try to find out whether there would be possibilities to accelerate the production capacity of vaccines. At that moment, we saw that some countries had started to vaccinate already. People were lining up to get vaccinations, but there was just a shortage of vaccines. So the question from Parliament was, can we do this quicker? Can we get these vaccines quicker? And are there any ways in which the Dutch government or Dutch companies can help to get an acceleration of vaccine production? And if I would have asked that question to you on the 17th of February, when I was thinking, shall I take this assignment or not, you with your regulatory background probably would have told me, Hans, no way that we can gear up the production of vaccines within 6 weeks to 3 months. It is just impossible. So I called a few people to find out whether there are ways, and they told me exactly the same at Janssen. No, it's not going to work quicker, but there may be ways in which we can help to educate the outside world about vaccine production. And certainly on the medium and long term, there are possibilities. So we had around 80 meetings with 120 people in 4 weeks. Many interactions also within Europe. In France, they had a vaccine envoy. In Sweden, I talked to my colleague, the vaccine samordnare. In Germany, they appointed Impfstoff-Tsar. So we had people all across Europe who were doing the same thing, and we came together as well. Quite some desk research and participation in roundtable conferences. So within 4 weeks, we then delivered a report with some 15 recommendations to the Ministry of Health, and one of them was about installing a task force where also Dutch companies would be involved. That task force started somewhere in April, May, and came up with another number of recommendations, which are now in the process, partly, of implementation. And if you're interested, there is a report, you can just go to Parliament where you see all these reports. Now, the major conclusions were, apart from the fact that gearing up production on the short term is not possible, we have enough vaccines. That was the good news in a way. Within a European context, the Netherlands had procured enough vaccines. But short-term scaling up, not possible. And that all has to do with the fact that just for COVID-19, the world would need around 10 to 14 billion doses, where normally, with all vaccines in all different disease prevention areas, some 4 to 5 billion vaccines are being used. So you can imagine that the shortages in vials, in stoppers, in bioreactor bags were huge. Sometimes for bioreactor bags, companies had to wait for more than a year before they could be delivered again. And this may have consequences, by the way, still today for other biologicals making use of the same components. Another finding, and again, for you this is bread and butter, but the fact that the supply chain was really global. Pfizer mentioned once in European Parliament, I think, on a hearing, that the components were sourced from huge number of countries, 200 components for making a vaccine. And at that moment, there were still quite some discussions ongoing about potential export barriers. And we tried from the Netherlands, including with a few other member states, to try to keep those as low as possible, those export barriers. It's only on one occasion that the European Commission decided to stop an export to Australia for about 250,000 vaccines. But otherwise, export barriers were not implemented from Europe. The United States was a bit different. India later on was quite different as well. But it's not helpful for global vaccine equity. If we look at the total numbers, and this is changing by the day, but it's quite a black and dark picture. At this moment, more than 250 million cases, 5 million deaths. The good news is that more than 7 billion vaccines have been administered. But if you look at the global vaccination degree, 50% vaccinated with one dose, and around 40% fully vaccinated. As you know, in the Netherlands, it's around 84% right now, but in some African parts, it's still less than 5%, and that is just not acceptable. From an economic perspective, the total costs are being predicted by, I think this was McKinsey, in 2025, 16 to 35 trillion US dollars. Trillion, that's with 12 zeros. It's enormous, these economic cost. And it ain't over yet. I made this presentation for another occasion, this slide at least, a couple of weeks ago, before we had the surge in the Netherlands. But even at that moment, the outlook was quite dark for many countries. For example, UK sees the highest daily death toll since March. China puts a whole city with 4 million people in lockdown because a few cases were discovered there. So I was actually getting all this negative news about COVID, as many of you are as well. So at a certain moment, I thought, let's try to find some positive news about COVID-19. Because you want to be energized and not just read the negative stuff. And the first thing I found when I looked at Google, positive news on COVID-19, was that Ed Sheeran tests positive for coronavirus. But, and that is positive, he could gig from home. If I do the same thing today, I did it this morning actually, positive news about COVID-19. The first which comes up is that the French Prime Minister tests positive. So unfortunately, it's difficult to find positive news, but after the presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago, somebody came to me and said, there is actually a website where you can look for positive news on COVID-19. So I urge you to have a look at it because you become far more happy. But there is positive news as well. For example, how a village in India reached 100% vaccination, that the vaccines are now available for younger populations as well, that the boosters are getting approval, that Melbourne, major city, 80% vaccination in Australia, and especially the one right here, where you see that BioNTech strikes a deal to open Africa's first messenger RNA facility, a local production facility right in Africa to try to become more vaccine equal in the world. Great news. Now, what are now the major observations? First and foremost, enormous teamwork, great unprecedented collaboration, and not only between companies amongst themselves. Merck is helping J&J to get their vaccines produced, Sanofi is helping, so Novartis is helping. Companies which normally would be competing are working together, but also between companies and the government sector, so public-private, and also public-public. A lot of collaboration, which is great, and we really would like to keep that. And then this great picture by a visual photographer, an artist who makes these beautiful pictures, which normally don't, fortunately, happen in real. It's Erik Johansson, a Swede. There was a sense of urgency. This picture was called Don't Worry, but people did worry, and that was the good thing, because there was a sense of urgency. Another of Erik Johansson, this one here, called Give Me Time, and we needed more time, but we didn't have it. There was a sense of urgency, and especially when you then look at how countries are, let's say, compared to each other. This was of February 21, early when vaccination started. Israel at that moment had already 67% vaccinations, Gibraltar 59%, and the Netherlands had just started. So that kind of sense of urgency, comparing yourself to best in class, is something we should do far more often. Regulatory innovation was also top on the agenda. Between FDA and the European Medicines Agency, a lot of interaction. Between member state regulatory agencies and EMA, a lot of interaction. But at the same time, I still remember that at a certain moment, before India was imposing its lockdown, there was a possibility to get Indian vaccine manufactured at the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world, Serum Institute of India, to Europe. The Brits could take it, but in Europe it couldn't come because it came from a line which was not in the regulatory framework for EMA. And that is a pity. Later on we said, happy so, because India then got its surge, so they better keep it over there. But nevertheless, it's not always as nice as it could be. And despite all that harmonization, these are the pictures which you probably are aware of. If you are a lay citizen, you just don't understand it anymore. At a certain moment, AstraZeneca had to be given to 55 plus, and later on, well, first to 55 minus, and later on to 55 plus. First because of perceived efficacy, later on because of the rare but severe side effects. So if you are just reading the papers, this is going to be very difficult, even though the intention of the regulators, locally and on a European level, was to instill trust. But it's sometimes very difficult to follow that. Another finding was that real-time data sharing, open science, was absolutely there. Great, you could find results within days after they came out, and without having a subscription to a certain journal, something we should try to keep as well. And then also important for companies, new models of risk sharing, that governments are stepping into agreements with companies to already procure vaccines prior to them being approved. Great models which could be potentially applied in the new post-pandemic world as well. And then last but not least, for those of you who come from companies, an increased appreciation for pharma. In the United States, almost 70% gave thumbs up. I'll stop with 5 recommendations to the Dutch government, and not all are on the regulatory field. The first one is about engage the private sector early. Teamwork, especially public-private and private-private, is something we should continue with, but it needs mutual respect. The second one is bridge healthcare policy with industrial policy, and sometimes even, let's say, development policy for the low and middle income countries. These things can go hand in hand, and other countries have given great examples there. The UK, when the vaccine task force was instilled there, they said first vaccines for the UK, secondly vaccines for the rest of the world, but thirdly to have an infrastructure in the UK which will overcome future pandemics. And the same counts for Denmark, where government money went to the development of vaccines. Germany, where they gave a tender of 3 billion vaccines, 3 billion vaccines for 5 years, on the condition that those vaccines will be manufactured on German soil. We have a great legacy in the Netherlands. I don't know, well, who knows of you, this person on the left-hand side? Please raise your hand if you know who this is. You don't have to answer the question, but if you knew, nobody raises his hand for those at home. This is Geert Reinders. And Geert Reinders, was somebody there? Geert Reinders was actually on the basis of immunology. He was the one who most likely was followed by Edward Jenner in the UK to start with vaccinations. Somebody from the north of Holland. Look him up, Geert Reinders, almost 400 years ago. And of course Janssen here in the Netherlands, one of the 4 approved vaccines. Invest timely in Plan B. And that means not just the vaccine manufacturers, but the whole supply chain, also the stoppers, also the bioreactor bags, also well, everything which has to do with vaccine production. We need more tech transfer personnel, more advanced purchase agreements, also for therapeutics, especially now that those therapeutics are available, and a pandemic preparedness plan. And this latter is now going to be submitted, or has been submitted by the Dutch Ministry of Health, a pandemic preparedness plan to the National Growth Fund here in the Netherlands. And finally, there are quite some positive side effects of the pandemic as well. Cherish those. The collaboration, the sense of urgency, the risk sharing, and last but not least, the regulatory harmonization that we hopefully can apply some of these learnings in a new post-pandemic world as well. And to give you one example, if you are a patient with an unmet medical need where there is no alternative, and because of collaboration, sense of urgency, and risk sharing, you will be allowed to get access to that medicine earlier than in the current world, that will be a great outcome. And that can be done because COVID-19 has shown us that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Especially like your concluding remarks, which puts it really in the focus of this meeting and any impact on patients. We have questions from... I don't see any questions from the live stream, but there is maybe time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So, Peter? Thanks. I will give you the mic because of the live stream.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that presentation. My name is Peter Mol. I'm one of the members of the RSNN. I'm from University Medical Center Groningen and the CBG. Very interesting that you're sketching this potential collaboration, that we should do more, but you also sketched the different handling of the safety issue. So I see divergence and convergence at the same time. How can we make sure that it becomes more convergent? Because obviously patients are in your country, are affected by the local media. So any reflection on that?
Yeah. One of my observations was that politics can play a huge role when it comes to decisions making on a member state level. At the moment that the first severe but very rare side effects of the AstraZeneca vaccine came out, I had a conversation with the Ministry of Health, the Minister of Health, the next day, and I was surprised that he took that decision, honestly, because I didn't see it, for example, in Sweden or in other countries at the same time. So I asked him that same question. He said, well, if I get a letter from Ton de Boer of CBG, which says that there are these side effects, it's a devil's dilemma, and I don't know what it means in English, but it's a huge dilemma. I had to take that decision, and that's because he's a politician, I think, because he can't then go to Parliament again if people would die as a result of that and face that same Parliament or the outside world. That is probably different in some other countries where politics played less of a role. So can we change that? No, I think that's inevitable. That's how the systems work. But what we can do, of course, if we would listen more to PROC, if we would have more conversations between the Tonderboers of this world and the other countries, that probably would help a little bit at least.
Thank you for your talk. Caroline van der Wal for MSD. I have a question. How does it, you explained the sort of the chain for vaccines, what we need. Was there also a part that the implementation of vaccines in Dutch GP guidelines, NAG, or is that something that will happen later?
You mean in Dutch NAG guidelines about vaccines?
Yes, because there's a lot of work being done, but sometimes there is a hiccup to get it implemented.
Yeah.
Was this the case with the vaccines, or was it not necessary because of the GGD was doing all the work?
Yeah. Well, one thing I explained very much in the last 9 months is that I looked at vaccine production and the possibility to gear it up, and I am not responsible for vaccination. And I made that very clear because one of the reasons probably why I was asked to do this, I had been, in my role in the top sector, I had been given quite some criticism on some of the things which were before the appointment on the 18th of February. So then people said, well, if you know it so well, then maybe you can do something about production. So on specific NHG guidelines or how the GGD works in the Netherlands, I've not looked at. So I have to stay away from that answer. But of course, one thing is here, what we saw with COVID-19, that for everybody it was the first time, real time and just in time. So guidelines normally tend to come quite later than after the actual decision, which I'm happy for. If we had waited for guidelines, then maybe people would not have been vaccinated that quickly. But otherwise, I just don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hans. For this very nice talk once again. I would like to invite the second speaker to the stage, Delphi Coppens, who will speak about the ATMP-treatment under the hospital exemption. Delphi is program coordinator for cell and gene therapy at the KWF, Dutch Cancer Society, a PhD candidate for the University of Utrecht from July 15 to January 2020. So you were promoted in the meantime.
I was, yes.
And that was on policy and regulations for gene, cell, and tissue-based therapy. So a real expert in this area. And Delphi will talk about the ATMP treatment under hospital exemption. Delphi, floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope I can have an equally engaging story as the previous story on COVID-19 for you, on ATMPs, and in particular ATMP treatment under the hospital exemption and how the regulatory divergence throughout Europe is creating unequal access and a high risk for unequal access. But I want to start with a little introduction into the ATMP definitions and the legislation to illustrate the background of why we have this hospital exemption in the first place. On the left-hand side, you see the situation before the ATMP regulation was implemented. And back then, gene therapies and cellular therapies were regulated already as medicinal products under the general pharmaceutical legislation. But the definitions were a bit narrower than after the ATMP regulation was implemented. So when it was implemented, the definitions were widened and now included more products that were previously regulated as human cells and tissues and blood products with, of course, very different regulations and requirements. So all the products on in the orange and green squares are the same products. They are gene therapies, cellular therapies, tissue engineering products, and combination ATMPs. But the situation in which they can be used is different. So on the left-hand side in the orange square, this is the main, say, the development box with all the clinical trials, centralized registration through the European Medicines Agency. And but on the right-hand side, in certain situations, you can use the hospital exemption for the same products, but under very less stringent regulations. And that's important to realize. So here we have the definition of the hospital exemption as it is written down in Article 28 of the ATP regulation. It is a regulation, you would think it would be applicable throughout Europe, which is true, but this is a clause that had to be implemented through the directive, so it is subject to national interpretation, and that is creating the regulatory divergence, actually. And this is the definition, so it is for ATMPs that are prepared on a non-routine basis under the exclusive responsibility of a medical practitioner for custom-made products. And even though this gives some direction, this is of course still rather vague. So after this, it was up to the member states to create their own national provisions for the hospital exemption. And those are depicted in this table here. So on top here, the non-routine custom-made. In 9 member states that were included in the survey or in the study, in a lot of those member states, the non-routine and custom-made was not even defined in their national provisions. Some countries give guidance, but it's mostly determined on a case-by-case basis if something is applicable or is eligible for the hospital exemption or not. But what this table also shows is that on top of those very few provisions that were implemented or were mandatory through the definition in the regulation, member states chose to implement additional provisions on top of that. And they relate to, for example, who can apply for hospital exemption. Some countries restricted to hospitals. In other countries, all parties can apply for hospital exemption, including private companies. It's also possible that if a licensed product becomes available through the centralized pathway, that a hospital exemption license is revoked, but other countries don't have that restriction. And also, some countries require clinical data, whereas others do not. So that also determines on what point in time along your development trajectory you can apply for hospital exemption. First in man, or in some countries you need to do first phase 1 or phase 2 study even, to be applicable for a hospital exemption, eligible. And those additional provisions are depicted in the figure here once more. Well, I can't really explain everything, considering the time, but there are roughly 3 intended uses by the authorities, and they're sort of related, of course, to those additional provisions in an attempt to use it in that particular way. And here on the left-hand side, you see the first situation, and those is for exemption situations, for unmet medical need situations, where really for a patient or just a few patients, these hospital exemption licenses are granted because there is no other treatment available and the patient could have some benefit at least. And examples are the UK, Italy, and Finland, for example. And in these countries, you also don't need clinical evidence, so you could use hospital exemption with really experimental products in these countries. Here, number 2 is the same situation, but the countries ask for some level of clinical data at least, and those are Belgium and the Netherlands, at least in the 9 member states that were included in this study. But then the third is a little bit different. It's quite different, actually. In these countries, the hospital exemption can be used for as sort of a national authorization for use pathway. So there are no restrictions how many ATPs are manufactured, for example, under the hospital exemption. It's not, the licenses are not revoked when a centralized product is available. So it is quite, it is the closest towards centralized registration, actually, in comparison to the other countries. They demand a lot of clinical data as well. But the difference here is that Spain restricts licenses to hospitals, and in Germany, companies can use hospital exemption license as well. And that clearly has implications for how it is used, which is shown in these 2 tables. On the left-hand side, you see a number of licenses that were granted in these member states. And on the right side, you see in some of those member states how those licenses were used actually for manufacturing. Not all licenses are necessarily actually used for manufacturing. So here you see those two examples again, so Germany and Spain. A difference here you can see immediately. In Germany, most license holders are private parties, and they use it to manufacture tissue engineering products. And that's because Germany has already had quite a big market of tissue engineering products in Germany. And in Spain, you see that one license was granted to a hospital, and they use it to manufacture gene therapy and medicinal products. And those are the two national use sort of examples. But in the other countries, you can see that most of those licenses are actually granted to academics. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that they are mostly used to manufacture on quite a small scale. And this data is applicable to a period of 10 years. So for some of those licenses, they only manufactured 0 to 10 batches of one type of ATMP. So that's one type of use. So that's the exemption situation. And then you have the situation where it is used as sort of as a national use. And I want to zoom in a little bit on the Spanish situation, because this was actually a CAR T cell therapy authorization, which is a bit controversial, perhaps you could say. And it was approved under the hospital exemption by the Spanish competent authority in April this year. This paper came out very recently in September, so the picture is not very good quality, but you can look it up for yourself. And this is a good example of how this is creating tension for patient access between the member states. Here you see a table of all the CAR T authorizations in Europe and how they were authorized. So all of the other ones, the ARI 0001 was the Spanish one, and the other ones were authorized through the centralized pathway. But then that does not mean, of course, necessarily access. The only thing we really know for sure is that the Spanish one is available in Spain. But it's not allowed to export ATMPs under the hospital exemption, so it's not available for patients in other member states, unless, of course, they would travel to Spain, perhaps, if that's possible. But on the other side, the centralized ATMPs, it's not guaranteed that they're available in all the other member states, of course. That's something I think that will come forward in other talks today as well. Because it's subject to marketing strategies and to health technology assessment decisions, of course, and those vary per member state. On the other hand, the Spanish authorization may also influence the availability of other centralized authorized products. And that shows how, in a way, it's a very complicated situation, actually, and there's no clear policy answer to sort of solve this, because there's tension between academic and commercial developments, which is creating competitiveness, but that again affects national and European level patient access. Now, going back to the Netherlands, there are two pathways to grant patient access. It is the hospital exemption for exemption situations with at least evidence of safety, clinical safety. And the other one is, of course, the centralized pathway of the European Medicines Agency. But there is one product group, in a way, that sort of can fall in between. Academic innovations with added clinical benefit. And this is something that we see at the Dutch Cancer Society. There are examples of these academic innovations. But they transcend the scale of the exemption situation. So this exceeds a few patients per year. They possibly have a limited commercial value. Either, well, you could have a discussion on that, but some have very complicated production methods, for example. And very often they're not ready yet to go to the European Medicines Agency, they don't comply yet with all the regulations for the centralized pathway. So they really they are at risk of getting stuck in development, and that's really a pity because the added clinical benefit can be there. So we see two solutions. The first one is to use the hospital exemption as it is used in Spain, and use it as a stepping stone towards centralized authorization. They can do that themselves, or they can, of course, collaborate with industrial partners. Either way, it is intended as a sort of, you could use it as a tool, regulatory tool, to bridge those two systems, the academic development towards the centralized pathway. But it's very important to ensure that it's complementary to ensure the whole system in Europe. And that's very important. And on the other hand, it is also very important to support academic developments to enter the centralized pathway. And that's not necessarily perhaps a regulatory discussion, but it's more has to do with supporting academics to optimize their developments as much as possible, so that they are doing, they're sort of delivering dossiers that are more compliant, at least towards the regulations. So we don't think it's either one or two, but both will be vital, I think, to ensure access to ATMPs in the future, in the Netherlands and in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphi. I think clear examples that it does matter in which country you live, although there is a centralized approval of these ATMPs, but there is so much alternatives and other ways to get to the patient. Time for questions? Yeah, sorry. Yes.
Hi, my name is Joost Wemels and I work at Janssen. Thanks for this great talk. And I wondered, what's your view on potential regulatory solutions to this, divergence, really, especially in light of the currently open consultation on the broader pharmaceutical legislation in the EU. Do you think there should be more provisions in the European legislation, or do you think this should be more focused on the national level?
I think it's a good start to incorporate this in the general pharmaceutical legislation. I think some guidance would help, at least to set some default level. At the same time, it may help to have a little bit of national. Of course, the competent authorities or the member states, it's their decision how to use it. But to do it outside of the legislation, I think it will be a very difficult task. So maybe there are more practical issues there if you would do it that way. At the same time, there are political issues if you try to do it on a European level. So it's a tricky one, I think.
I totally agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Joost. Thank you, Delphi, for your interesting talk. We want to move to the next speaker, and that is Wim Goettsch, who is with us on the live stream. Yeah, here he is. Okay, welcome, Henk. Can you hear me? Wim, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can do. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well, thank you. So just a short introduction. So your topic is on the screen already, health technology assessment, and you will also address convergence versus divergence. Wim is a special advisor, HTA, to the Dutch National Healthcare Institute, better known as ZIN. And he's also an associate professor of HTA at the University of Utrecht, specifically to lead a project on the development of new methods for HTA. Wim, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Sjaak, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. little bit less about the format to actually participate in this meeting. I was actually looking forward to be there, but also because of COVID-related incident, I could not attend and was actually forced to do this online, but still good to do so. I think that this topic, convergence and divergence in health technology, is really also a topic which goes to my heart because it's a very relevant topic in health technology assessment. And you're probably also already aware to some extent why this is a relevant topic. Let me see whether the slides work. Yes, so what I would like to do very quickly is to discuss with you some examples. Divergence in HCA, so what's the background regarding divergence in HCA? How is it related to the process organized in the different member states? And I will give you a few quick examples. But then I will also give you what some would say, positive news in terms of convergence in HCA, and I will also quickly share with you two examples, one on what we would call European convergence and one about regional convergence. I would like to finish a little bit about, well, what about regulation in HCA? And so it's just a little bit like at the end, but I also think that this is a very relevant topic. So just to give you very quickly what is the issue if we compare HCA, for instance, to regulation. Well, we have a system, one single licensing system for drugs in Europe, one single EU legislation with well-defined and agreed assessment criteria. So it's a very clear, well-developed process which already has been there for quite a while. On the other hand, as you are aware, there are 27 different HCA and pricing and reimbursement systems. And it's important to realize that these are all into national legislations and they use different methodologies and assessment criteria. And these can be very, very diverse. So quickly, if you would like summarize it in a very quick graph, you would say, well, you have the centralized process for market authorization leading to availability of that specific drug on the European market. But then subsequently, there is this national process for pricing and reimbursement. And it's important that what we call health technology assessment is really what we would call relative effectiveness assessment, but also other criteria like cost-effective assessment. And an organization like my organization, ZIN, actually comes forward with a recommendation which subsequently will lead to a decision about pricing and reimbursement. And in most instances, especially if we talk about new advanced drugs, this will be the ministry, but sometimes it also can be directly taken over by health insurers. And if this drug comes available and there's a certain price, the reimbursement scheme, subsequently also clinicians may decide how this will be implemented in their guidelines. Well, just to give you a very quick example of all these differences, and I don't want to go in detail, but just to quickly already indicate how diverse it is, because you can look at it at different ways. And I lent this slide from a colleague from mine from CRS, which actually looked at one hand on what kind of system processes are there in the countries, and on the other hand, how is the HCA process actually organized? And you have all kind of combinations of that. So if you look at the system processes, for instance, there can be separation between regulators, HCA, and subsequently a coverage body. This can be different organizations, and they can do all this their activities in certain sequences. But in some countries, for instance, the HCA and the regulator are in one organization. In other countries, there might be a regulator, but then the HCA and the coverage body could be in one organization, or even some examples where they're all in one organization. So you see already that already has, I think, a big influence on how this whole process is being handled and organized in the member state. On the other hand, if you look at how actually the HCA is being performed, which we would call the HCA process archetypes, you could have like first what we call a therapeutic value assessment or a relative effectiveness assessment, subsequently an economic assessment, and then an appraisal. And sometimes this can be separated processes. Sometimes these can be the therapeutic value and the economic evaluation can be done in one process, leading to an appraisal process. In some countries, there is no economic evaluation leading to an appraisal. So also over there can be many differences across the member states. And as you can see, there are many countries which are actually in the different parts in this table, showing a lot of differentiation within Europe. And then I think very quickly also to explain that there's also sometimes a lot of discussion on what HCA actually means and what HCA is. And there are many different definitions, but the one which is here is, I think, one which covers it quite well, because it's not only about medical, but it's also about social, economic, and ethical issues to the use of health technology in a systematic, transparent, and unbiased manner. And it's actually there to inform the formulation of safe and effective health policies that are patient-focused and seek the achieved best value. But if you, for instance, hear all the discussions about European HCA, a lot of these discussions are actually about what we call relative effectiveness or therapeutic value, which is actually the clinical part of the HCA assessment. And one of the definitions which is quite commonly used is actually the thing, well, it's defined to the extent to which an intervention does more good than harm compared to some alternatives for achieving desired results under the usual circumstance of healthcare practice. And you really have to realize that if people talk about European HCA and about European HCA regulation, it's actually about relative effectiveness assessment. And I would like to just show you a few examples of work what I've been involved in, also I think others in your room, where we actually look, well, what kind of a divergence do you actually see in Europe? And for instance, this is an already somewhat older article, but still I think very relevant, in which we compared these relative effectiveness assessments of oncology drugs in Europe. And what this shows, and again, I don't want to go in that much detail, but just to show you that here we have a number of different types of drugs, different types of indications, and we compared the HCA recommendations between a number of member states: Germany, the Netherlands, France, England, Wales, Scotland, and Poland. And not only in the color of the difference, but also in the outcome, you see already the differences. While, for instance, Germany, and Netherlands, and France, which have a very clear separation of the therapeutic value assessment and the cost-effective assessment, you see equal benefit, added benefit, and lesser benefit. But of course, you see differences between those three countries. But for instance, England and Wales and Scotland and also Poland already take that therapeutic value assessment together with their cost-effective assessment and come subsequently to a positive or to a negative recommendation. So also here you see quite a significant number of differences between the countries. But also if you look to the process, so this is about the outcome, but also if you look to the process, you see differences, for instance, in the timing, which can be quite significant. This is a more recent study, actually, which used also data from pharmaceutical companies, where I said, well, what do you see in terms of when does this recommendation actually becomes available? And this was about a number of European countries, but also about Canada and Australia, where actually was looked at how much time does it cost from market authorization before we actually have a kind of recommendation from an HCA side. And here we also looked at, in general, all the drugs which were being assessed, but we also looked, for instance, at oncology drugs. And also over here, you see a large divergence between, for instance, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Also reflecting, I think, partly the differences in the processes. Sometimes it also, of course, has to do with the timing in which a company decides to actually file the submission in the country, which might also lead to some delays, especially in smaller countries. So we have having these examples of divergence. I think, of course, there has been a lot of discussion within Europe. Is this really necessary? And can we actually achieve more convergence of HCA in Europe? And I think there have been different roads to this kind of convergence. And I would just want to share with you two examples. So you have this what we call regional collaboration between a few countries. And I think the example which I can take is the Beneluxa, which is a kind of collaboration between Benelux, Austria, and Ireland. And then we have the European collaboration, as well known as EUNETA, the European Network of HCA. But then you also have to look at the scale or the way actually this collaboration is being organized. At some extent, we think that the Beneluxa is really going what we would call full Monty. So working together on early dialogues, working together on horizon scanning, on the joint HCA and the post-licensing evidence generation, but even on the pricing. So it shows actually that the whole part of this can be done together, but at least a number of member states. Well, if we go to EUNETA, it's much more focused on what we would call the early dialogues, on the joint relative effectiveness assessments, and about this additional data collection after market authorization. Well, just a few words on EUNETA. I think it's important to realize that this kind of collaboration has already been there for quite a while. And I think starting in 2006 up till 2016, there have been a number of joint actions which actually worked on methods, on implementation of those methods, and especially in the last joint action until June this year on actually working out these pilots to standard practice, for instance, the early dialogues, but also the joint clinical assessments. And quite recently, another project has been starting called EUNETA 21, which is a smaller project in size, not only in the duration, but also in a number of organizations which are involved, which actually is the final stage to the EU HCA regulation, on which I will say a few words later on. So you see that this kind of collaboration has been there for quite a while, and it took quite a while to actually get where we are now. And this is the website of EUNETA 21. I think it's important if you're not aware, because the EUNETA 21 just quite recently started. So if you're interested, you can go there and actually can see where they focus on, and that the primary focus is really on the joint RIAs, so on the joint relative effectiveness assessments, on the early dialogues, and a little bit also on this post-licensing evidence generation. So EUNETA is really about this part of the equation. So it's not about the whole HCA, but it's about the relative effectiveness assessment and how can we do this together. And this, if you go to the EUNETA website, you can actually see that EUNETA Joint Action 3 did, I think this is 13, but I think finally they did like 16 or 17 joint assessments. And it is very important to also note, if you look to the authoring teams, that there has been a quite significant contributions from all the member states being authors, which are the first two in line, like for instance, Finland and Norway for the first assessment, France and Portugal for the second assessment, and the reviewing organizations, which are on the second line of every assessment. So there was a lot of commitment from all these organizations, HCA organizations around Europe, to actually make this happen and to have a good quality joint relative effectiveness, which could be used on a member state level. And we also did an early assessment on how much is actually being used. And it shows indeed that many countries have been using some of these assessments on their national level. Interestingly, we as the Netherlands, as actually a coordinator of EUNETA, did not. And that has something to do that these drugs, which were actually taken up in this comparison, were drugs which were actually not assessed as part of our risk-based approach, because these were drugs which had a very small budget impact, a small patient number, and therefore were actually not assessed by the Netherlands. So this is then what we would call the end game. I think that finally, at the end of this year, there was an agreement between the Council, between the Member States and the European Parliament about a new HCA regulation. Again, I think you have to be very clear. It's about these joint clinical assessments, joint relative effectiveness assessments, and the joint scientific advice or early dialogues. So that's what we actually see within this European regulation. And you also have to be aware that this kind of agreement will be finalized before the end of the year. It will take at least 3 more years before they really start. And even then, I think there's a kind of idea that we would firstly start with doing this for oncological drugs and ATMPs. And then after 2 more years, I think other orphan drugs will be included. And then after some times, I think all these drugs, new drugs at least, will be assessed in these joint assessments. This is just quickly also a slide on this collaboration in Benelux. I think that is also a quite recent development, that there was a joint price negotiation about Zolgensma, in which Belgium, Ireland, and the Netherlands worked together and came to a joint price negotiation and a joint price assessment with the company. I think that was very unique, and I think it's also a kind of model which you will see more, especially this type of ATMP and orphan drugs, where countries like the Belgium, Netherlands, Ireland, maybe later on Austria, will work together to come to these kind of price negotiations. Well, then just to finalize, I also see that I'm a little bit at the end of my speaking time. What about regulators in HTA? I think it's not as much about convergence as it is about alignment and process efficiency, because I think you still have to realize that there are different remits. But there is a very shared feeling that more understanding of both processes leads to actually in contact leads to alignment, and better alignment of the processes will also lead to more efficiency. I think just to show you an example of what the early work I was involved in was actually making the EPAR more efficient for HCA use. So we had a kind of collaboration between EMA and UNETA to actually ensure that the EPAR has a better description on how the data were being selected, how the data were being analyzed, and how the data were reported. So they actually were of more use for the HCA reports. And I think that based on that, I think the EPARs always have become more and more an essential document in all the clinical assessments of the HCA organizations. But this is a national example. I think there's also, because this kind of process alignment also happens, is a shared I could slide from Lee Truong, my colleague from the Zorg Institute, which shows that also in terms of national processes, if there are parallel procedures, you can really have an efficiency in process. But I think you can also get more understanding between the regulatory agencies and the HCA organizations, how they do their assessments. And I think at the end, it will also lead to some form of convergence in what they think is relevant and important for the patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Wim. I liked your statement about convergence, where you said, well, this is actually alignment, but I think it all starts with alignment, and it took EMA also 25 years to go from alignment to convergence. So thank you for your talk. Let me see, are there questions on the chat? On the live stream, I don't see anything, I think. But there is a question here in the room from the patients. Carine?
Thank you. Is there any way that
can you hear? Can you put
is there any way patients' organizations are involved in the EU net HTA?
UNETA.
UNET, sorry.
Yeah, I think that we have worked with the patient organizations in both the early dialogues as well as in the joint relative effectiveness assessment. So if you see the process, for instance, for the joint assessments, I think there's a clear pathway from the beginning that patient organizations are involved in defining the PICO for the assessment, but subsequently also, for instance, what are the important outcomes, how do we compare, but subsequently also in a later stage when there are concept reports that are being shared with patient organizations. And for the especially the joint early dialogues or scientific advices, I think many stakeholders, including patient organizations, are also actually participating in these meetings.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wim. For the sake of time, I want to move to the next speaker. So thank you, Wim, for joining us virtually, and feel free to stay with us on the live stream. Thank you very much. The next speakers, I should say, represent the patients, and that is Carine Besselink here in the front, and Wim Altena, or Altena? Altena, and they both represent alternating the patient. So, Carine, the floor is yours. And Carine is EUPATI fellow, a member of the RSNN advisory group, again representing the patients, and she's active in the Netherlands for, amongst others, the Nierpatiëntenvereniging Nederland. Wim, I will introduce you already. Wim is patient advocate and EUPATI fellow as well. He has an MBA in change management at the University of East Anglia, and he will speak after Carine.
Thank you. You kind of stole my introduction.
Oh.
Welcome at this to the presentation, the perspective of the patient on upstream governance and downstream divergence, which is held by Wim Altena and myself. We are both volunteers at the Dutch Kidney Patients Association next to our other activities as a patient advocate. The topic of today is to reflect on the different stages before medicine or treatment in effect is available to the individual patient. The regulatory fast approval helps to facilitate the development and expedite the review of new drugs that treat a serious medical condition and fill unmet medical need. By speeding up the processes, new drugs can get to the patients in need faster than they normally would through standard tracks. However, after approval, how fast does it actually reach the patient? For example, as we heard, the vaccines of COVID, the individualistic approach of the European countries caused a delayed access to vaccinations against COVID-19 for patients who are vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus. Patients like me, people aged 18 to 60 years old with a high-risk medical condition, were due to receive the first vaccine in February 2021. In reality, we had to wait until the end of March before it was our turn. For me, that turned out to be too late. I only had one vaccine before I was infected with COVID-19, and I had to be hospitalized for 5 days in a hospital. Had I received 2 vaccines on time, it might have been sufficient to protect me well enough to avoid hospitalization. Of course, this is just a single case, but it's plausible that this applies to more patients. The longer you wait, the higher the risk you will be affected. Unequal access to medicine and treatment after approval of the European Commission due to national differences in Europe have a significant impact on the lives of patients. It means that there are consequences for health benefits depending on which country the patient lives in. We will explore some examples here. Okay. If the focus of new medicine and treatments is reimbursement instead of regulatory, more specific, the focus on costs, then availability differs across countries. To illustrate what that means, for example, patients with auto-inflammatory disease in Belgium have no access to the medication they need because Belgium has not approved them. On the Belgian border, patients literally receive their prescription at the front door and the medicine itself at the back door. Or the medicine will be ordered and delivered by post office box. It's even more complex in other countries like Srebrenica or Romania, where caretakers from neighboring countries have to work closely together to make sure that patients gain access to their medication they need. One way is to convince pharmaceutical company to provide these medicines off-label if the country allows that. A difficult task for the patient organizations involved. Lack of these medications will leave the patients with auto-inflammatory disease with a worsening of the illness and probability for damage at kidneys, hearing, and sight. A medical shortage or delayed access to medicine is also an issue. When we depend on countries in the East for our supply of medicine at low cost, the stakes are high. Problems that occur in production or transportation of medicine supplies have led to shortage of medicine in the Netherlands, out-of-stock situations. More and more patients today in the Netherlands have heard their pharmacist answer, "No, I'm sorry, we're out at this moment," when they order the next dose of medication. A patient with high blood pressure, however, will need its medication anyway. So the doctor and the patient will have to look for a substitution, which will cost even more because the substitution may not work sufficient enough to lower the blood pressure. Another difficulty the patients in the Netherlands face is the high cost of medicine and the political decision to prefer handout generic medicine instead of brand medicine. A significant group of patients with different backgrounds and diseases are really physically bothered by that. It takes a lot of effort and action from several organizations and parties involved in medicine to care for the patient who really needs to continue to take their medicines as they have did before, to treat the disease or symptoms. Maybe a minor issue compared to the subjects before, but medicine tourism is a phenomenon seen at the borders of our country. Belgians come to buy paracetamol, for example, in the Netherlands because a package here costs only about €1, while in Belgium the price tends to be 6 times more high. Same goes for nasal spray and anticides. So maybe countries should join forces to keep the prices more equal. Last but not least, the price of medicine is also a huge challenge when it comes to very expensive medication, like orphan drugs. How to gain access as a patient to your medicine in this situation? After the next slide, I will be happy to give the floor to Wim Altena, to share his story about how to overcome this difficult issue. So what can we do as a patient? Well, we are fortunate to have a well-organized infrastructure in the Netherlands. We have patient organizations, so we can easily stand up for our interest and cooperate with each other and stakeholders. A basic need is to have access to mobility and technology, like access to a computer, internet. It seems very normal these days, but it's not normal in all the countries in any country in Europe. Sometimes financial resources when you have to travel abroad for a medication or a treatment. In the Netherlands, as in 23 other countries in Europe and beyond, we have the EUPATI training. It's a study for patients to learn how to cooperate with patients' research and development and, to stand up for our rights in this way. And now I will give the floor to Wim Altena. And he will explain you how to gain access to orphan drugs.
Micro.
Doesn't work?
Again, I started saying thank you for having me here, because it's always a pleasure when patients are invited to explain their view on things. And the first sheet is a sheet I used in my working years. I'm a pensionado now, because this is a sheet that says a lot. And the main thing for me is that this is a sheet that can build bridges, because if we accept each other, then it's possible to talk about your different perspective. And nowadays, I don't want to make this too philosophical, but nowadays I often think there is not enough respect in our society. So we all have seen Rotterdam last week. We used to not to talk about our differences, but we are fighting about them. I will tell you a story about the approval of a very important drug for me, because I'm a patient, I'm an atypical HUS patient, and I can tell you something about the disease, if it works. Yes. It's an orphan disease. Its estimated incidence in the Netherlands is only 15 or 20 cases a year. What it is a disorder in your complement system. But what happens with you when the disease becomes active, it leads to a kidney failure. And another thing that's very difficult is that the diagnosis is very difficult to make. This all happened to me. I became sick in 2006, but the first time they diagnosed it as an atypical HUS was at the end of 2010. There was no cure at that time. The only thing people could do is give you a plasma exchange, but that was not very successful. So the alternative was go on dialysis. That happened also with me. But at a certain moment there became a very promising new drug on the market. It's called eculizumab. At that time, there was a protocol from the pharmaceutical company that said you have to use it lifelong every 2 weeks. It was very expensive because the costs were 500,000 euros a year per patient. And the problem we had as patients was, how do we get this drug reimbursed in the Netherlands? Because there was already a situation with SIN, and we talked with them, and we had some talks with the WAR, Scientific Advice Board, and the drug was also for PNH patients, and they didn't approve it. It was too expensive. So we had to find a way. Talking about convergence, this drug would never be allowed in the Netherlands. What we did as patients was we did some research, and maybe strange, but we did research with the company. We went to the company and asked them 2 questions. The first question, very naive, was, explain us why is the drug so expensive? And I always say to people who do the same work as we do, always ask them that question. You never get an answer, but you have to ask that question. The second question was, why do we have to use the protocol you described? And we talked with their medical people, and they couldn't give us a good view on it. Mainly they said, it's approved at the EMA in this way, so we have to use it in this way. But we did also some research in Nijmegen with the expert center. And there were some professionals who said, we don't know why the protocol is like this, because you can work with a lesser dose, or you can work with start and stop criteria. And try to imagine what that is for a patient when you have on the one side the company who says you have to use it lifelong every 2 weeks, and the other side you have professionals who say, maybe you don't have to use it, we can examine. So we came in action because we had to make a decision about who are we going to support in this as patients. And we made the decision to go with the specialists in Nijmegen. And that was very important because Zin was talking about reimbursement. And for us, it was very important that the drug should come available. And we talked with them about introducing a study called the Curious Study. I'm still thinking it's a great name. It was an idea of the mother from a PhD student, but we're still happy for finding this name. And we came up with a study, and to start to do research about the start and stop criteria and a more personalized treatment. In the study, we said there had to be a few patients, because one of the main things in this study will be safety. Because you can understand when on one hand there is the protocol from the pharmaceutical company, who says you have to have it every 2 weeks, and on the other hand, people say, no, you don't have. It's very important for patients to know what is safe. What we did, we made a business case, always important to show what possible results it could have. And not only results based on safety, but very important also about cost effectiveness. And we came, we had a discussion with Zin, and after all, they said to us, go for it for 4 years. Try this study for 4 years. It was we were very happy with that. They had some things to say about it, because they said you can do it for 4 years, we will reimburse it, but you have to use the Dutch guideline for treatment, and that was the guideline from the expert center in Nijmegen. They said both patients and doctors have to support the registry, and that was a thing. Because I always say when I have these talks that in the Dutch, that there's a problem between the Dutch centers, university academic centers, and I call that problem the not invented here syndrome. It's very difficult to get these doctors to work with each other, because they always think their cure is the best. There's low acceptance. It's the view from a patient. We can discuss about it. But what we did, we established a group from 16 people, nephrologists, from the 8 academic centers in Holland together. Dus what was the result of the divergence?
Any questions to either Carine or Wim at this moment? No? Any questions on the live stream? No. Thank you once again. Very clear presentation. We move to the next speaker, which is the last speaker before the break. No pressure, Tony. Tony will speak on the title as is here on the screen, the perspective of the regulator on upstream and downstream convergence and divergence. And Tony is, his current job, if I can say so, is Head of Regulatory Science and Innovation Task Force at the EMA. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to check you can hear me okay. It sounds like you can, so that's a good start at least. And first of all, I have to thank the organizers for inviting me back, because this is my second time that I've had an invitation to speak at this event. Last year it was virtual, this year it is physical, and maybe if I'm lucky you invite me again next year, you might even feed me something in the evening, so we can look forward to that, like, you know, even a cheese sandwich, I'm very easily pleased, you know. Okay, but the second thing, before I kick off with this, I have to apologize for my presentation. And the reason is I was blown away by the quality of some of the preceding speakers, and particularly starting off with Hans GCP with his wonderful sort of graphics and images of Sweden and God knows where. And I can promise you there's nothing like this in the slides to follow. So a little bit like me, it's a little dry. But there is apparently a break where you'll get some coffee and liquid outside. So I got the message from the chair not to delay you unduly on that. Okay. So I'm very literal, and this was sort of the brief of the talk, and I'm speaking more generally. I haven't gone for a COVID-specific angle on this, and we have this rather simplistic vision of the system of an upstream regulatory convergence, coordinated and structured, and then this you know, naughty downstream divergence by the individual member states with their own interpretations. And I'll draw your attention to that wee little decision diamond in the middle, the marketing authorization in between, you know, that wonderful convergence and that somewhat problematical divergence. And the questions were posed was, does this have an impact on accessibility to patients of medicines and treatments? I think the case was made very strongly by the preceding speakers. Are the differences inevitable? Unfortunately, I believe the answer is yes. It's the economy, stupid. And are the differences undesirable? Again, the preceding speakers have made the case that those differences are undesirable, and you know, there should always be a sense of urgency, particularly where you're dealing with innovation and unmet medical need, because indeed the patient is waiting, and sometimes the patient is dying while they're waiting. So that is the reality we all should face. So I wanted to go into the decision diamond, and sorry, you might think this is motherhood and apple pie, but we should actually celebrate, and particularly when you reflect on the HTA colleague then on the ZIN presentation, what we have built. And I heard the chair, I think, said 20, 25 years. I would even say it started in the 60s, so you're looking at 60 years of convergence. But you know, all of the licensing procedures in Europe, and it's very important not just to focus on the innovation, but also onto the essential medicines, results into this wonderful set of positive benefit risk decision at a point in time for a marketing authorization, a common summary of the product characteristics for the physicians, for the pharmacists, the healthcare professionals, a common package leaflet to inform the patients, and that's taken as a standard now, guys, but it was a first in the world at the time, near enough. And a common labeling to allow that free flow of the product, at least in theory, around a single market Europe. The HTA ZIN actually referred to the fact that the public assessment report that was also 20, 25 years ago, the industry predicted the death of the pharmaceutical industry in Europe if we ever issued a public assessment report, and lo and behold, nothing like that has happened. And indeed, we have them both for central and national products. And there is this coordinated oversight of the product in clinical use, because, you know, it doesn't end there, safety oversight, etc. And indeed, then those phase 4 studies, the repositioning of the product that the previous speaker alluded to. So that's all to the good. And on the other side, and you might say this guy is a little bit egocentric at the EMA, pretty much all new active substances are approved centrally, even without a formal legal mandate for that. Pretty much that's what happens, has happened for the last 10 years or more. And very importantly, it's an established basis for the follow-on products, those generics and the biosimilars. And it's very interesting, the product that was being referred to, Soliris, on I believe in the last sort of example, yes, you know, negotiations and positioning on the clinical use can lead to those cost effectiveness, but what's really going to be a bit of a game changer is it goes biosimilar 2022, and therefore you spread out the access, and there's no doubt that generics and biosimilars, you know, they really have pressure there, and they increase the access to patients, not just in Europe, but indeed in other regions as well. So I would argue all to the good. I'll just draw your attention to the little thing in the right-hand corner, the infamous blue box, which every centralized product has, and it puts in those little difficult discussions of pricing, reimbursement, legal status of supply. Who's authorized to sign? Is it a GP? Is it a hospital specialist? And of course then, how good or bad we are at negotiating pricing and reimbursement. And that really is, when I lived in the UK for many years, they used to refer to as a postcode lottery, and indeed with the nations, Wales, Scotland, England, it can depend where you're sitting, where you get. In Europe, we have the same thing, a member state lottery with regards to how you access particularly innovative products. But before going to the sort of downstream convergence, because, essentially, having identified that there is problems with the downstream divergence, I also want to examine a little bit the upstream convergence, because, it's not all rosy in the garden if we're really honest with ourselves. And what we have here on the development phase, and indeed the chair already alluded to it, a very, long-established international conference harmonization, ICH process, to give us largely a quality, safety, efficacy set of guidance that largely allows a global dossier and largely, a basic package that pretty much gets you in a regulatory approval almost on a global basis. So there's, a high degree of convergence on that, not just in Europe, but globally. And that refers to those guidance. The other thing which is very important, and this is really, it was mentioned by the HTA colleague then with regards to, these early dialogues, is what happens in the scientific advice space. And that can either be a discussion you have at the national level, and that's why the colour is a little bit sort of, mottled there, because it isn't all harmonised. Depending on which member state you talk to, you can get slightly different advice there. And of course, we do have a centralised offering, and indeed one of the colleagues in the audience is vice chair of the Scientific Advice Working Party, so he can certainly comment a lot more than me on that. But the other important area to go in this upstream, and we have to look at now, is an area of historical divergence, let's say, was in the clinical trials, and in fact the type of trial that was just being described in the previous speaker, and that's a good thing in terms of variety is very strong, particularly in science, but there can be occasions when it's very good to have more convergence in that area, particularly to deliver impact. We saw that with the current COVID crisis. How many times did you hear the trials are too small to deliver meaningful results? We had a lot of pressure to come together, do larger protocols in a faster amount of time to generate the evidence quicker, to guide those therapeutic decisions. It was a battlefield in 2020 with regards to intensive care units, etc. So to some extent, clinical trials it has got both opportunity but also threat there in terms of the level of harmonization. And we're on the edge of the clinical trial regulation, eventually, hallelujah, kicking into force beginning of next year, and there's a lot of ambition there. But I want to develop a couple of things. On that scientific advice, I'm putting in the HTA players, and that's both at the national and at the central level, but it's far from a systematic offering. It's a very intelligent offering because to some extent, in the era of global development, we can't afford to have a multiplicity of development programs tabled for either member states or even regions, so we've got to converge on what that evidence generation should be, and the HTA colleagues need to be part of that discussion. But ultimately, it would be good to also involve the payers. And it's a bit naughty of me even putting them up there today because they really are not present. Certainly at the central level, they're not present, but they could be present at the national level depending on the degree of sophistication you have in the country you happen to find yourself in. Okay. But way before we get to that decision diamond about the marketing authorization at the central level that gets you access in principle across Europe, you do have these early access tools. And it was very interesting then with the ATMP hospital exemption type of thing, because to some extent, what is a hospital exemption? You could almost see it's a sort of N=1 clinical trial. And there are a number of early access tools whereby you can get access to innovation. They're not by any means harmonized across Europe necessarily. Your application, a very your ability to have a policy on your clinical trials at the national national level can actually be used for that. Compassionate use programs, also national discretion with regards to the different degrees of sophistication around Europe. And increasingly, and coming back to what Hans was saying about risk sharing, particularly seen in the COVID, but there's a lot of these sort of upfront risk sharing agreements, particularly for some of these very expensive, innovative developments but really are game changers with regards to the patient outcomes. And you have some of these managed entry agreements years before we even get to a marketing authorization. And then finally, I just wanted to, on this slide of the upstream convergence, everyone's talking about horizon scanning. Certainly the HTA guys are investing heavily in it because they want to know what's going to impact the health system to try to create some headroom to allow for that to hit. It's all about the unmet medical need, if anybody can succeed to define that, because it's an ongoing discussion. Certainly our contribution to that has been the PRIME scheme, the Priority Medicines Europe scheme, which essentially sort of, anticipates an accelerated assessment. It's essentially the business of trying to pick winners upstream, a couple of years upstream, trying to give them maximum special love, special attention to develop them as best they can, such that have the best positive outcome to actually make it into the hands of the healthcare professionals and the patients. So pretty much that's what we're about in terms of trying to see what's in the pipeline that truly addresses the unmet medical need. But the interest in that discussion is by no means confined to the regulator, but is also shared with the HTA, the payers, and, God forbid, the physicians and the patients themselves. Okay? So now to this sort of downstream divergence, the source of all our problems, maybe. Those member states with their own interpretations, my God. So first of all, and I've used this expression before, even apologies if you've seen it, the title of our agency is the European Medicines Agency, plural, yeah? So we do not govern the practice of medicine within the healthcare systems. We're essentially about doing a benefit-risk assessment for medicinal products, originally thinking about a single market, free movement of those products, and conceptually enabling the access and availability of those products to the people that need to use them. Pretty basic idea, like the single labeling. But it did not say that we have to govern, and we don't have the power to do it. It's absolutely national. It's not even national. It can even be down at the local physician level with regards to, prescribing off-label, whatever. The other important point, there is no obligation on any member state to include centrally authorized products in their national health systems. That was their day one, part of not the current regulation, the 2309/93 regulation. So people that were talking about in the 1980s were saying, oh, this centralized system, we do not want to have this obligation to fund it because maybe we can't afford it. We don't know what these guys are going to approve. So to some extent, there was always that understanding that decision on the funding, the HTA and the downstream payer type assessments, whether it's the combination of the therapeutic value together with the economic, that much more sophisticated assessment, positioning of the product, that very much was left and is seen as the national discretion. And that's essentially what I have here. And I'd like to think there was only 27 authorities dealing with this in Europe, but that's actually not the case. There's even more multiplicities when you go down to the regional level. And then also you have the company launch plans, because it's not just the idea that the authorities give you a license. It depends what the companies do with the license. And very sadly, in the Commission have commissioned, no pun intended, many studies over the years, some very heavyweight studies on, 20 years after a centralized approval, what's been the penetration of those products, whether it's orphan, whether it's high volume products. And honestly, pretty much in every case, the outcome is not very reassuring. There is a tremendous divergence of access within, a first world European Union, let alone the rest of the world, 80% of the patients left untreated for HUS, for example. And sad to say, or not as the case may be, company launch plans of the wealthier and larger countries come first. Sound familiar? But I mean, that's the reality, and that's been shown out by the data. And then finally, you have clinical treatment guidelines, both national and regional, and vaccination strategy. And we started off with the presentation from Hans being an absolute case in point, with regards to that national or even regional specificity. And that comes back to my primary point that even when we do a risk-benefit assessment and give a primary marketing authorization, and even with rather detail saying, you know, it's approved in children, it's approved in adults, whatever, the special populations, how that actually gets used in a given member state then is still left to the discretion of those local clinical treatment guidelines. Think antibiotics and resistance patterns, but we've seen a full diversity with regards to the vaccination strategy, and I don't think anybody is proposing a centralized vaccination, medicinal oversight or direction anytime soon. So it's something that we have lived with, we are living, and we'll have to live with in the future. So, to some extent, then, what are we doing as a regulatory system to improve this situation? So that's, the next couple of slides, I just want to talk you through a series of strategies and sort of hang on to your hats with this because, you can sort of drown in the strategies in the next couple of slides. But first of all, I'll start up with one that's close to my own heart because I was involved in it, and it was the regulatory science strategy of the agency, which we issued in 2020. And this was our previous executive director, and he came out with this sort of vision statement. Everybody needs to have a vision, guys. So EMA must catalyze and enable regulatory science and innovation, and if you remember back to my job title, Chair, and to be translated into patient access to medicines in evolving healthcare systems, That's a long way from simply saying you approve through the centralized procedure and issue a marketing authorization. That's essentially recognizing that benefit risk positive marketing authorizations is only the beginning of a rather complex journey to allow true access and availability to the patients when you go through the HTA and the payer type systems. But it's essentially saying that we as regulators have got a role in that translation. We can't just be passive observers of some sort of tennis match between the upstream development and the downstream access decisions. So, in terms of our strategy, and there's a whole bunch of points here now, but I just want to give you a flavor as to most of these refer to that upstream convergence, the uplands that are meant to be mature and well run. But, it's just amazing how we believe to invest in that in order to reap the benefits downstream. So we have invest in our prime scheme, those priority medicines, integrate the scientific advice, reinforce the patient relevance in the evidence generation. I mean, that really is, people talk about patient-centered development, but does it really happen? Foster innovation in clinical trials, and that's very important. I mean, that's a real issue for Europe now vis-a-vis a competitive, global situation where clinical trials are done in the States, they're done in Asia, and for any new innovation, the idea that those trials would never be done in Europe is a loss of opportunity for the patients in Europe. Promote use of real-world evidence in decision-making. So this is absolutely, and we are investing heavily in that as a network system because we truly believe it'll help those HTA and downstream payers to make more informed decisions with regards to the positioning of the products, those sort of relative effectiveness studies. And it's actually harvesting the benefits from all of that government investment in digitalization of healthcare systems. That's what that's about. It's not about a lowering of evidence standards, because that's the case for the prosecution, that we are sort of somehow trading our gold standard of randomized controlled trials and are sort of buying into some sort of fuzzy real-world evidence discussion. And that then links to those two other targets in that slide: contribute to the HTA preparedness and collaborate with payers, So that's what we'd like to do under the RSS. And I'll move quickly on because we have a network strategy as well, and largely the themes on access and availability we have aligned. And one of the earlier speakers talked about the importance of alignment, and we have very much in a 5-year strategic ambition aligned on those areas. Look at it: evidence planning, post-licensing evidence generation, bridging to the HTA needs, engagement in the review of evidence and review of evidence and methodologies, respecting the remits of the various players. That is exactly the concern that Wim was talking about there. We can have a good exchange, but we also know that job we're set up to do. But there's no reason why we shouldn't, collaborate on horizon scanning And we believe then that if we deliver on these objectives in the next 5 years, we'll address unmet medical needs, and we should have broader and earlier access coverage. At least that's the ambition. And, you know, guys, I could stop there now, and that would be a reasonable thing. But it would be remiss, because the Commission themselves in the pharma strategy have put an incredibly ambitious agenda to resolve, or at least move this objective along. And therefore it would be remiss if I don't at least cover that briefly. And that's the next couple of slides, and then it'll be a close you'll be glad to hear. So they have this pharmaceutical strategy for Europe, and there's more than that as well. You know, we have the mandate extension, the setup of the Health Emergency Response Authority. We know we have the Beating Cancer Action Plan. We know that we have the European Health Data Space. But honest to God, in a slot such as this, even just to talk about this is good enough, at least to finish off this reflection. So, does anyone have a problem with this? Delivering for patients, fulfilling unmet medical needs, ensuring accessibility and affordability of medicines. And nowadays, you know, those two go hand in hand, access and affordability. But they break it down into prioritizing unmet medical needs, ensuring the patient's access to medicines, and ensuring affordability of medicines in, you know, the financial and fiscal sustainable healthcare systems. So that's what it's about. So I'll break it down a little bit in the next couple of slides. One on the antimicrobial resistance, and a lot of commentators will say that is going to be the next sort of pandemic health challenge. That's not a pandemic, if you follow me. But I mean, it's one of these things that has been ignored for decades. We know it's a problem, but nobody's doing very much about it. But there is a real thing that this really could jump up to bite us all very severely if this thing ever breaks through. So there's a number of initiatives there, and it is those innovative approaches on the public procurement, which to some extent has been piloted now. You know, if you contrast this pandemic versus the swine flu we had 10 years ago, there was no centralized public procurement in Europe at that stage. And certainly I think when this pandemic is written up, that European level procurement is definitely going to be seen as a success factor. That's my own personal belief on that. And we have a new player on the block here with the response authority that will actually do alpha to the omega type investment. At least that's what its brief will be, to sort of stimulate that development and manufacturing. So there's a tranche of initiatives there for antimicrobial resistance. There's a whole host of others then, particularly with the revision of the legislation on the pediatric and the orphan legislation. And basing on the experience, that's probably more of a rebalancing exercise between the sort of push and the pull in that particular area. It's also been challenged because the definition of orphans that we've been dealing with 20, 25 years ago really didn't sort of foresee the sort of genetic revolution that we've been dealing with in the last 10 to 20, the new biology, if you like that, and or at least the new understanding of the biology. And maybe it is time then to reposition the whole incentives in the orphan area with that revised understanding. But there's also a lot of emphasis there on facilitating, you know, getting the health technology assessment bodies and the payers involved with the committees. So to some extent, we were already doing that, and Wim, you know, highlighted what UNETA was about, and we had done that voluntarily, but there is a sort of push to do that a lot more systematically, and it'll be helped by the HTA regulation, but that should not be the full extent of it by any means. And there's a couple of other items there in particular, which I'll draw attention to the last one there: enable parallel scientific advice on clinical study design for medicines by the HTA bodies and the agency, and that will be is foreseen, the early dialogues in the HTA regulation, and that's a really good thing, because to some extent then the evidence that we're generating is not just for that primary marketing authorization approval, but it should enable at least the relative therapeutic efficacy type assessment, if not then the further positioning on the economic type assessment further down the stream. That last might be a little bit of a stretch though. Other aspects that they have in the patient access to medicines type of theme is to revise the system of incentives and obligations in the legislation. And it's basically the balance between the intellectual property rights to support innovation, but then also the access and affordability of medicines. And that's pretty much the borderline between the sort of innovator industry and then the follow-on industry, if we can understand it that way. We have the, again, reviewing the legislation to address marketing competition, improving access to generics and biosimilars, including interchangeability and the bowler exemption. Bowler sounds very technical. It just means that they can do the trials such that they're ready once either the data exclusivity or the patent expires. Those medicines can be approved, and in theory then that does almost immediately lead to a greater access to a wider patient group. I mean, that's the whole principle then of the follow-on competition. We also wanted to understand, and one of the patient colleagues was referring to shortages and the difficulty that actually creates. It's a real thing, you know. It's fine being moved maybe from one brand to another, but a completely different product, particularly if something like a respiratory, where you're very dependent on the sort of what you get from your inhaler. It's not so easy actually to substitute another one. It's very important that we manage those sort of shortages and try to understand what the root causes of those deferred market launches are. And there's also a support there with regards to these big buyer initiatives. It's very much the leveraging. I think Wim called it the full Monty approach. So I think that is the sort of, there's advantages in leveraging your size, particularly in price and reimbursement negotiations. And the last one then was on the affordability of the patients, the financial and fiscal sustainability. The first one, I've read it a number of times myself, guys, and I'm really wondering what lies behind or exactly what's been driven at. Revising the legislation to address aspects that impede the competitive functioning of the markets and to take account of market effects impacting on affordability. My God, that's a hell of an objective if you unpack that one. The next two are maybe a little easier to understand. Develop cooperation in a group of authorities, mutual learning and best practice exchange on pricing, payment and procurement policies to improve the affordability and cost effectiveness of medicines and health system sustainability, including on cancer treatment, And there, to some extent, I suppose, if you say there's been 40, 60 years investment on the primary marketing authorization, that product at the central DCP, MRP level, if there's been, and Wim showed the sort of 2006, I think he said the collaboration was, that's 14 years to get to a HTA regulation with another 7 years downstream, staggered implementation. So you're looking at 20, 25 years plus. Where are we on that timeline with regards to a sort of price convergence? So these are the sort of seeds of potentially, why not just talk methodology, guys? And then similarly, there are non-legislative measures to improve transparency on guidelines on principles and costing methods for establishing the research and development costs of medicines. So, there are a couple of what the Commission would call flagship initiatives that don't rely on legislative initiatives, but that they believe will improve the environment in the area. And I know I've skipped through all of that, but I mean, the serious take-home message is there's a lot of convergence upstream, but there's still a lot of work to do, particularly on the scientific advice and the platform with the HTAs and who knows in the future with the payers. There's an opportunity with the clinical trials and intelligent use of clinical trials, and I would suggest the hospital exemption on the ATMPs is a feature of early access ever before we get a marketing authorization. And there's a lot of commitment and focus, I think, as an agency, as a network, and indeed then as a sort of system from the pharmaceutical strategy revision that says we can do more in the downstream space to improve the ultimate access and accessibility to the patients. But it's a work in progress. And that's why I want to leave you with the final reflection I have, or perspective, is however beautiful the strategy or strategies, we should occasionally look at the results and indeed judge by the results that we deliver in a sort of 5 to 10 year perspective. And with that, Chair, I would like to thank you for your attention, and hopefully I haven't overrun unduly. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very inspiring talk that our simple topic of today fits in a very nice, bigger, very much bigger picture of the European Commission as you sketched at the end. So thank you for your reflections. One question, two questions, maybe from the audience. I think you're all highly impressed of this talk. So, or you, Peter, you have a question? Yeah.
Because it's hard listening to somebody speaking from the European perspective when you've just seen the patients who see the divergence really coming to them. So I'll come back later. I'm hosting the panel discussion afterwards, Tony, so I can ask you more questions. One was that you said, well, EMA is not governing medical practice. And especially with the antibiotics, you're talking about the optimal use of antibiotics. So I was wondering, how do you connect these two, in my mind, divergent ideas?
Yeah, I mean, antibiotic usage is absolutely a classic case, because actually the situation in Europe is not homogenized. It's not and it shouldn't be harmonized in a sense. I mean, if you have a resistance pattern in the southern European states that isn't there in the Scandinavian, then the nature and type of their antibiotics in terms of their therapeutic arsenal recommendations will be different in the different member states. The actual labeling of the antibiotics, the best that we can do is to ensure a harmonized labeling, breakpoints, whatever, and give that information and have a commitment to update it. But we won't take over the responsibility, certainly not at the central level, to then dictate which product gets used in which order, because that would need to be customized to the country, if not even the region. And antibiotics is a genuinely, it is a justifiable, scientific, clinical situation that is different depending on what region of Europe you find yourself in.
But it's making the data better available on breakpoints, etc., that people can use the antibiotics more appropriately, rather than saying, okay, you should have. My PhD program was trying to implement evidence-based guidelines around antibiotic use, and that was in local hospitals already very difficult, because it's not just the level of, okay, we have information, but the information should be interpreted and used. And I saw there the friction between what we do at the European level and what could be done at local levels. But I see you provide better information, you provide better guidance, better SMPCs perhaps.
Yeah. And the other thing, I mean, maybe the SMPC is the wrong instrument for that. And in fact, there was an idea to put the breakpoints out of the SMPC and into another sort of curated location. But that for something very technical like that, it would be good to provide a further subset of information that would actually, be of use to the microbiologists that are actually in charge of setting up those local regional guidances. To some extent, even going back to the HTA point about they were happy that we had evolved our European Public Assessment Report, which primarily was meant for the public and in language that was sort of interpretable, understandable by the public. But, if there's a community out there like the HTA that needs much more technical information, there's no reason why we shouldn't endeavour to provide that in a more comprehensive way, supplementing what the primary offering is in terms of the basic offering, I would suggest. And I think, nowadays with sort of, all this evidence becoming, electronically available, there's no reason why that can't be made available more quickly. I mean, I think the first speaker referred to the benefits and the joys of open science. I mean, we've had a bit of a battle with the industry that's rather famous about releasing clinical trial data information post-approval such that the scientific community can engage with that. And although that's been a difficult sort of journey, I think pretty much most people now think that's a really good thing. And that is way beyond the level of information we started off with 25 years ago with a 10 or 20 page EPAR. And now you have essentially all of that data is available in a public domain space.
Thank you. Okay, thank you once again, Tony. Thank you all. There is a question from the live stream. Sine Escola, she's from FPA. She will be on the panel. I will read it out. Is there awareness, Tony, about the root causes to company launch plans. Do you believe this can be solved by revision of medicinal product regulation, or perhaps through other means to increase convergence, how countries can support access and availability to medicines on the national level?
Yeah. I mean, that's a hell of a question, and honestly, I think that would be a good question for the panel with the full, spectrum of representatives there, particularly the HTAs and payers. I mean, to some extent, if a company has a license, can you then tell them you must agree a price in each and every country, particularly if each and every country has got a different price agreement mechanism? And then either they can do a deal or they can't do a deal. What happens if they can't do a deal? I mean, how can you force a company to do a deal they're unwilling to do? I mean, you can say to a company, if you don't launch your product in every member state, within 2 years of approval, you lose your license. But define launching a product then, because you can place the product on all markets, but for private use only, without having agreed a price formally with the member state, unless of course you tell me there's a prohibition on that. And I think the difficulty I see there is that I'm not too sure how you can force companies to market products if there is no mechanism to somehow agree a price that's acceptable to both parties, the member state market and the company.
Yeah, well, I think that's a real point for discussion. And as Sini is in the panel discussion with you after the break, then we might come back to this topic. So thank you for now. We have a break. We are behind a bit. So I would suggest that we come back at 4:30, 15 minutes break. We can gain back some time in the panel discussion and a short closing remarks. After the break, we first have Bernard to talk to us about the wider perspective of convergence further versus divergence. And after that, we have the panel discussion. So the break is outside. Please be back at 4:30. Thank you. Second part of this session is a presentation by Bernard Steunenberg. I will introduce him in a second. After that, we have the panel discussion, which will be led by Peter Mol. Marjan Postmoy, who is on your program, unfortunately, she has symptoms of a flu. I'm not calling it anything else than a flu, but unfortunately, she couldn't make it to the panel session today. So she will be replaced kindly by Peter Mol, who I will introduce already now. Peter is member of the steering committee of the RSNN, and he is a professor in the University of Groningen. And I think most relevant for today, he's also the vice chair of the scientific advice committee of EMA. So a very well-positioned expert for today and to lead the panel discussion. But before we go there, I first would like to invite Bernard Steunenberg to the floor. As I already said, Bernard will give us a perspective from the outside. He's not at all a regulator. Knows until 2 weeks ago he didn't know anything about regulatory affairs. That's what I'm quoting himself. So, but he will give us, as I said, perspective from the outside world on the European legislative system. Bernard is scientific director and professor of public administration at the Leiden University, and anything else he will introduce himself. Bernard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great introduction, and I was very pleased to be here because I heard all kind of very interesting, and I mean very nice stories before the break, including exciting contributions which nicely link to the things I would like to discuss with you during my talk presentation. Now, before starting, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, because especially when I heard that actually this group is only for university personnel coming from Groningen and Utrecht, I thought, wow, they dared to invite someone from Leiden. So that's already very special. And secondly, it was already mentioned, I wasn't aware, well, 2 weeks ago, I think I was already browsing through all kind of, let's say, documentation about this field. But let's say 2 months ago, I wasn't even aware of the exciting fields you're working in, which of course is normal because if you look at the acquis communautaire, it's a huge set of, let's say, rules that affect all kinds of bits and pieces of, let's say, Dutch, but also other societies in Europe. So in that respect, it's very nice to make myself a little bit more acquainted with some of the discussions and debates and problems in this field. And then about me, well, I'm a professor, apparently, well, I'm a professor, sorry, at Leiden University. My field of expertise is EU policy making and especially the implementation of policies in member states. That's something which I find very interesting. It's also something which is slightly more complex and therefore many of the PhD candidates try to avoid this field because it's complex in the sense that many things play a role here. But since I'm a little bit older, I thought, let's move in this direction. So I started when I was younger with EU legislation, comitology, and later I started to research some of the elements here dealing with implementation, which in itself is also very relevant for today's debate about upstream convergence and downstream divergence. What are we going to do? Well, maybe a bit of clarification. I'll start with this. Then I'll move to the ideas about what divergence actually may mean. And then I think would like to make a step with you by moving a little bit more to what I would call policy development, where politics steps in. And one warning, today I heard lots of, let's say, interesting wishes, people would like to, etc. I fully share those kind of thoughts. But as a scholar, I would like to know what is and how it may work. So if you get slightly disappointed with me, it's not so much that I do not share your mission, your kind of ambitions, but I'll hope to tell you a bit about what we found out about some of those developments and what kind of hypotheses or propositions we have about what may occur. So I hope not to disappoint you by sending you home before 6 o'clock and before even the panel discussion that you think, oh, this is really, let's say, awful, and therefore I don't want to listen again to this person coming from Leiden. So I'll do my best to keep the attention and to give you a couple of insights from my field that might be relevant for your field. What I will do is, I was kind of, let's say, writing lots of things on my overhead this afternoon. I'll start off with something which Anthony Humphreys and also Wim Goettsch, hopefully I pronounce his name correctly, already did. And I thought, wow, they did the same. So apparently it must be quite central to the topic. To map a bit the different things and elements in this field on regulation, broadly taken, to find out what is going on. And that helps enormously in order to discuss, let's say, the main issue of convergence and diversity or differences. And we start upstream. Upstream is green, downstream is blue, walks in later, with some of the things you already know, the nice procedure where the European Medicines Agency plays an important role, which we have heard a moment ago in the last presentation of this first part of the program. Then there is this interesting element, I would call this little development principle. I understood from some of the participants it's not widely used of, let's say, the mutual recognition. But mutual recognition is quite important, especially also for this area, because it creates trust. People start to kind of, let's say, understand the other in as far as there is a other player in this field. So this is part of the upstream situation. Then we go downstream. And downstream is quite interesting because it has all kinds of boxes and elements. The element over there is the National Medicine Authorization. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my terms. I heard there that there is also, and it was in the presentation of Delphi Coppens, the hospital exemption issue, which plays a role in that area between, let's say, the green and the blue box. And finally, we got lots of information about the darker blue box here of national pricing and reimbursement. And I think quite a few of the presentations dealt with the complications over there, the differences in availability and differences in the pricing, difference in the use of medication, which was quite prominent in, for example, the presentation of Besselink and Altena. So this is the field, in my view. And first of all, we have, let's say, something happening over here. Uniformity, hopefully, convergence. That's the well-known idea of upstream conversion. Would like to have something similar occurring in Europe. And there is this box over here, the dark blue box, which is a bit troublesome, because there we find differences which we associate with downstream divergence, differences in ways of acting which have to do, for example, with the fact that we do have national health insurance systems, which is not yet part of, let's say, the acquis communautaire in the strict sense. So to me, and that's the route I was planning to take, there are two problems. One problem is a more static one, which has to do with implementation. And I'll show a couple of slides about this by indicating that implementation, well, may require more flexibility in achieving something which a policy would like to do. The other problem, which I wasn't completely aware of, is a problem of, let's say, policy development, a little bit more dynamic. A problem of kind of, let's say, trying to push the policy one step further, which became very clear out of the presentation just before the break, where, let's see, ambitions of, for example, the European Commission were presented. And that's a problem of, I would say, creating a new policy at the European level in which 27 member states need to agree on something. 27 member states, or most of them. But still, there plays an important principle role, which we call the lowest common denominator principle, saying so much that the one who wants the least is the one who's going to determine, simply put. And that is something which you also have to take into consideration. Now let's make a start. I have here a heat map, and don't start to, there's not the purpose to read all the details. I think the slides will be shared, so you can always read them at home. A heat map of the implementation of something which is also dealing with people, like, let's say, patients. In this case, it concerns, let's say, people who would like to stay for a while in another EU member state. So we're not talking about, let's say, third country nationals. They talk about you or me trying to live in Germany or Belgium or France and want to have a residence permit, meaning so much that you want to stay there for longer than 6 months. And there has been research done about the implementation of this directive stemming from 2004. Let me just check that I'm not saying the wrong thing. Yes, 2004. So it is something which is around in the EU for quite some time. So the idea that this is very young, new, and exciting, and therefore people, member states are not implementing this directive correctly because of that, is not, let's say, something which is an explanation. It is there for almost 20 years. The boxes indicate how well the performance is, spread over 4 criteria, and look at the heat map, and what do you see? Differences. Well, divergence might be an indication of this. Huge differences. There are a couple of countries, there are a few more who are doing quite well, including Latvia and Denmark. But there are also countries that are doing less, like the Dutch. So we, let's say, tend to feel that the Dutch way of doing is the best. Well, not quite if you compare this with the performance of others. And it can get even worse if you move There used to be, there might have been a Belgian visitor today here, but maybe the person is now watching the live stream. But Belgium is not doing it well at all. It is red in all categories which are used in this piece of research. So we find lots of differences between member states. Now, maybe some of you say, okay, this is just the case only for the residence rights policy, which is, by the way, a very simple policy, which I tend to tell my students there actually should be a machine at the border where you push the button, you get your permit, and then you drive into whatever the country is you want to settle. It's slightly more nuanced, but it's not super complicated. Still problems. Another policy. This is the Professional Qualifications Directive, something you may also know that it exists. It's a little bit more complex in terms of who is affected by this specific directive, but actually it tends to give you the possibility to have your diplomas, your experience recognized in another member state the moment you want to move. The Commission did a kind of, let's say, search on how this policy is implemented. There's a bit of nuance. The first row is recognition with compensation. So there is, for example, then the possibility of asking you to do an internship, an additional kind of course, maybe up to half a year or so, in order to qualify yourselves in the same way as that is seen in that specific country. And the second row, number 2, is recognition without those kind of measures. And they measure here in the different colored boxes the number of, let's say, a positive versus negative decision. And negative means red. So if the proportion is quite high, the redder, let's say, the boxes get. What do we see here? Well, again, an image of huge differences in the way in which member states implement this policy. Take, for example, here Estonia and Ireland, they do quite well. So that might be an opportunity for some of you, if you don't like the Dutch weather, you might want to focus on these countries. Although maybe Ireland is not in that case a very nice choice because it seems to rain much more often than here. The Dutch, well, moderately, if you are rather positive. And who's doing quite badly, for example, the Italians. So going to the sunny south would not be an option from the perspective of the implementation of this specific piece of EU legislation. What does it mean? Well, you have had now, let's say, 2 examples of rather different ways of implementing EU legislation. And based on research, there are about, let's say, 3 major reasons why we find those kind of differences. And I just put these all on slides. Systemic, the first one, dealing with capacity and capabilities. Institutional, dealing with, let's say, different uses of, let's say, policy concepts or cultural differences which are embedded in policy quite often. And lastly, number 3, the orange box, preferences or incentives. People think differently about matters. And I try to kind of, let's say, illustrate them a bit with reasons more applied to, let's say, the area of medicine, but I think you can do it even better than I. But if you think about capabilities and capacity, it has to do with, let's say, locally or nationally, and let's say the expertises, the resources they have, whether medication is affordable. Go to the second box of policy concepts. It's about, let's say, ways of thinking about, for example, risk and what kind of, let's say, safety precautions need to be taken into account. Also, the different ways of assessing those risks might be quite important here to see why there are differences in implementation at the national or subnational level. And finally, the last box deals with actually conflict. Conflict maybe between, let's say, the industry wanting to have something else than maybe patients. And these are factors that may create, let's say, differences in the way policy is implemented. Well, it's interesting, you can also use these factors to kind of, let's say, hypothesize about, let's say, the success of a policy. So if you want to implement a policy, then you need to take into account the capabilities and capacity. If you don't, then the success levels will be lower. The same applies with the institutional reasons. And lastly, if you focus on, let's say, preferences or conflict, that also may lower the success of policy. This leads to a proposition, maybe to help also the discussion today, based on, let's say, the insights from implementation research. And my statement here is to be successful, implementation of a policy requires this flexibility in order to adapt this policy to its, let's say, local circumstances. And local circumstances, you can fill in the factors which I just mentioned. Dus the success of a policy is partly also determined of having this flexibility. And without it, well, most likely the policy is not going to work. So this is finding number one, which somehow affects, let's say, the debate about convergence and divergence. I think, let's say, within a system of unified regulation, you still will find, let's say, certain differences because there is this need for adaptation to local circumstances. The first step. The second step is by focusing on now the dynamic side, on policy development. What will happen? What is possible? And here, there also in the literature about how the EU works, a number of hypotheses which are very interesting to mention. The word hypothesis, I should maybe rephrase them in terms of, let's say, almost like propositions, results that have been found. I split them in two different groups. The upper group of the red-colored hypotheses are the ones who emphasize the importance of member states. Member states are still, let's say, important actors in the EU legislative system. And the green ones are more policy-driven from the perspective of harmonization. But let's walk through those hypotheses which are quite prominent in the literature. The first one on top is the cost of adaptation hypothesis, which says so much that member states tend to protect their national regulation by imposing those rules on the EU policy in terms of, let's say, in the moment of, let's say, formulating something new or reforming the policy. The reason for doing so is that member states find it difficult, and the same, you can see it in the Netherlands in many pieces of legislation, difficult to change their own national legislation because that's quite costly. Costly not only in rewriting, let's say, parts of their own law book, but also costly in convincing the implementers to do things in a different way. This is a very interesting hypothesis because it means that 27 member states are trying to impose their way of working on the European lawmakers so that they adapt this kind of, let's say, framework. And as you may kind of, let's say, expect, what will happen is that you won't have, let's say, one uniform system, let's say the Dutch system, making 26 member states very unhappy, but you have some mixture of bits and pieces of different regulatory regimes, which makes the whole thing maybe a little bit unbalanced. But that's the way in which, let's say, the European process may work. The second one is the hypothesis about protecting one's own regulatory regimes. And this is quite prominent in some areas. The hypothesis reads as follows: EU rules protect, actually it's a statement, protect national regulatory regimes. And an example is, for example, social security regulation in the context of the EU. It is there, but it is a coordinating system that avoids that you are paying twice your contribution, or receives twice the benefits of Social Security. So the whole system is built on the idea that as a person, you will have, let's say, to pay once in one system, and you will receive the benefits from the system as well. And this, of course, applies especially by those of you who work in and live in different countries. So let's say you work in the Netherlands, but you live in Brussels, or vice versa. And this system gives, let's say, the tools for those member states to maintain, to keep their own national system. Without it, there will be huge problems. Maybe these two are a little bit pessimistic, but still, I think these are results to keep in mind, thinking about, let's say, further developments in your field. The other two are more policy-driven. The first one, in the green box on top, is the functional spillover hypothesis. Very interesting. it says that resolving a problem creates new problems which ask for further regulation. And I think everyone here must have experienced something alike also in your own field. So it is like a snowball which continues. There's always something which we forgot, which was unexpected, but somehow needs to be repaired. And that is the way in which regulation may roll on over time. The second one, the failing forward hypothesis, has become popular in recent years, says that the lowest common denominator principle, which I just a moment ago explained, leads to bargains that are imperfect solutions. The reason why is that only, let's say, the one who wants the least is determining what comes out, leads to imperfect solutions causing for new crises and requiring reform. So it's a bit like the snowball, but in this case driven by, let's say, the imperfection, driven by the problems caused by the fact that member states do not fully agree, but they compromise, and in the compromise they get an imperfect solution which later causes problems. And that is, let's say, those are the ideas about policy development, not in terms of what should, in should I follow you, but in what is, so what may happen. And therefore I brought hopefully slightly more optimistic, but I think more realistic expectations about, let's say, policy development also in this field. So if we take, let's say, EU regulatory policy on market authorization, they may reveal unexpected, as we saw today, unexpected consequences. And those will be input for further negotiations, but not in a big bang and a big step forward, realizing all the ambitions, but more in a model of muddling forward, muddling through, making small steps and realizing and creating perhaps again problems in a few years. The second proposition is about those national health insurance regimes, which have been discussed in quite a number of contributions. And this is, I think, let's say, a rather problematic element. The pricing and the way in which, let's say, some of the medication is put in the insurance system, this will, in my view, means that the upstream convergence, so the harmonization of all the systems, will be somehow limited, because it requires member states to give up that system, that way of controlling also the cost of, let's say, the health system in a country, giving up towards and giving this kind of, let's say, authorization to of this field to, let's say, the European Union. Quite difficult. I don't think this is something that will be realized at short notice. At the same time, it can be a wish, it should, but I think the is that there is a realistic element here saying that this may be highly problematic. And therefore, I think, let's say, the conversation which started through the European Commission is the good way forward, but it may not lead to results in a year or so. How likely, last slide, and then I'll stop, how likely is it to have full convergence? I mean, it's always nice to speculate, but it's also nice to know what the conditions are. And to mention a few, you have to think in terms of what kind of policy do you then have. But also, how do you then assess, let's say, the input of the different member states? And I've put the two here in this simple matrix, this diagram. On top, it says, let's say, the national ideas about, let's say, whether they support or do not support such an initiative, taking into account that you just need one member state that doesn't like it, and that won't be happening. So if you have, let's say, national incentive towards change, then you are in the first column, and the second column is about, let's say, member states who somehow remain split, and therefore no change will happen. The other dimension is about, let's say, the kind of policy. So is it a policy without no exceptions, no discretion, and strict enforcement, and you need to have them in order to make sure that everyone is doing the same, or you have, let's say, exceptions and or discretion and or limited enforcement? Well, the point is you have, let's say, full upstream convergence only in the first cell, where you have, let's say, member states agreeing on this policy, plus, let's say, a policy that is rather strictly formulated without any discretion to those member states. In the older cells, there remains differences between the member states. Why? Because either the policy allows this or they don't like it. Still, I think it would be good to continue the conversation and to have a debate about it, and forming networks and creating some common kind of, let's say, discourse about it may help in moving forward towards the ideals of more convergence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Questions from the audience? No, is there a question on the live stream?
Not yet.
I heard we had to wait a couple of seconds.
Yes, they are in delay.
But I don't think there is nothing on the screen. Well, I have a question.
Ah, okay.
You said at a certain moment, you said the successful, I think, convergence, you said, it's to adapt to the local situation, right? That's what you said.
In implementation.
And then, but you also said in an earlier slide, at least that's the way I interpreted it, if you adapt to the local situation, you inevitably go to the lowest common denominator. So is there...
No, that's about, let's say, the process of developing a European-wide policy.
Okay.
So if you want to have a European-wide policy, then you have to kind of, let's say, compromise. You have the 27 member states, and actually you have also the European Parliament. But I forget for the moment of the European Parliament, but the 27 member states is already highly problematic, because it means that the Romanians should be excited about this policy than as the Dutch. Well, if they are, great, let's move forward. But maybe there are differences in ways of assessing, let's say, the cost and other aspects that might be important to, let's say, the things you would like to propose. So that's the lowest common denominator in practice. It shows that you are somehow bound, based on the fact that the European Union tries to decide on the consensus, and sometimes they move a little bit more towards qualified majority voting, but that is in the ultimate situation where, let's say, most of the member states passionately want to move forward, while a few are not really very kind of, let's say, constructive. And I've seen a couple of debates where this happened. Then they are prepared to leave this and move forward. But you need to have, let's say, a huge number of member states on board in order to have a European policy. About implementation, that is a different story. There you have, let's say, these local or national needs, and you need to take them into account. If you don't do this, then I fear that the policy in itself will be officially adopted, but not very successful in the way it will be implemented later on. And you will see, and you remain to see, let's say, difference, like you saw in the case of the residence rights policy or the policy on professional qualifications.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Nevertheless, we will stay ambitious, right? Okay, so that leads us to the panel discussion. Can I invite the panel members? I think we will leave the chairs there, or will they be put on the podium? Yeah. So we have on the panel physically here present Tony Humphreys, and I introduced him already.
Bring your own chair.
Schikan is there, yeah. Then we have on the live stream we have Sini Escola. Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for joining. And there is an open question for you, or at least you asked a question to Tony, so maybe you can come back to that. Sini Escola is, I have to look up my notes, from FPA, and she is, apologies that I don't know this by heart, she's the Regulatory Affairs Director at FPA, and you graduated as a PhD in Utrecht as well, but currently you're based in Brussels, right?
That's true, indeed, and not graduated yet, unfortunately, still doing my professional PhD project.
Okay, well, you're one of your promoters or maybe co-promoters is next to you on the live stream. Maybe he can help you a little bit. But I'm speaking about Bert Leufkens. I guess you all know him. Bert is currently the chairman of the Regulatory Science Network. Couldn't make it today with us, but he's so kind to join virtually on the panel, and we'll close the session the day also after the panel. Then we have Larissa here on my right, representing the patients. Larissa is also a patient advocate, and she's at PSC Patients Europe, which aims to promote the interest of primary sclerosing cholangitis patients in Europe. Welcome. And then we have, I think there is one. Yeah, Sabine Strauss was planning to be here, but as I said before, she couldn't make it, so that chair will remain empty. And as I said, I already introduced Peter Mol, the panel leader of today, and also member of the steering committee of the Regulatory Science Network Netherlands. There, the floor is yours. And I think we have until, let's say, is it okay that we finish up at 5:30? Is there any problem? Okay, I don't see any. Is that okay? Yeah, let's do that. So, okay, Peter, go ahead.
Thank you, Sjaak. I was asked on the train to moderate this group. Very happy to do that. We have about 23 minutes with 5 speakers and 5 panelists, so I guess we'll have to do quick. I will go a short round for those who haven't introduced themselves, and I will start with Larissa, giving a perspective on how you as a patient perceive, well, convergence and divergence in the field of medication availability and use. And then I'll go to Sini and Bert for very short impressions from their perspectives. Larissa?
Yeah, thank you. From the patient's perspective, of course, I share a lot of perspective with the patient speakers. I just wanted to stress what stood out for me in this day, and especially with the first speaker, I was very struck with to cherish the positive side effects from the vaccine, whole exercise, and especially the risk sharing. That really stood out for me as a patient, because I think, to move forward, you have to take risks, and to share those risks in an efficient way. That would be really, really great. The ATMP part, that was for me as a patient, especially the academic innovation and the regulatory gap, that is something that I, as a patient, really do care about. To facilitate the academics and to overcome that gap and to speed up the processes, that would be great. And on the HTA, that is a real headache for patients. That rainbow sheet that was shared by all the different processes and time lines, that is really one of my headaches and one of the headaches of many patients. And if that can be overcome, that would be great. Of course, it is a no-brainer that if you look at it from a scientific way, it is something that could be harmonized and should be harmonized. And I understand that there are differences in budget and differences in medical practices in the different countries. But if there could be a big effort to either harmonize that or at least take a look at early access for patients or how do you say that, the compassionate use programs, that would be a great help in the time that we're waiting for pricing and reimbursement. So, yeah, and then at last the EMA part and the well, we are as patients involved in scientific advices and the EMA processes, and I think that is really a good process, which I have been. Well, I had the honor and the pleasure to be involved in a scientific advice workshop of not a scientific advice workshop, a workshop to be involved in a reflection paper preparation. So I think that is great, and that should be, well, used much more, and also the combined with the HTA, and I really like the idea of having the payers involved in that process too. So if those things can evolve and get to a great end, that would really serve the patients in the end.
Mm-hmm. So I hear this one thing coming back. I heard it also from Wim Altena and Carine Besselink very much on, obviously in the end, and actually Tony said it, you have to mind the economics. Yeah. Stupid, I think he even said. And I think that's obviously underlying it. I think the presentation we just had before on the public convergence and the way how the regulations are implemented in Europe and countries look differently. Obviously, the budgetary factor is there. So what's your perspective on that? I mean, I understand that we want to have access. And is then divergence at national level not maybe a blessing if you're living in the Netherlands, or what? Because you're a European patient.
Yeah, exactly. And I have been part of PSC Patients Europe, actually. Well, it's a different story, but we looked at actually also to support the European patient to stand up for itself and support getting these organizations developed at the national level. And of course, if I look at it as a Dutch patient, I am probably blessed. But on the other hand, I also represent a rare disease, and for my disease in particular, or this disease in particular, there's no cure. So in the end, I still have to see whether at the time that there is something that it will be reimbursed, and that I am lucky in the Netherlands. I'm not sure if I'm lucky in the Netherlands. So, and of course, if you look at it from a European citizen's perspective, it would be great if that is harmonized. But of course, yeah, we have to mind the economics and be realistic about it.
Hans, you were talking about obviously the vaccine development and the convergence and in the process of producing them and getting them ready. But then we see that the distribution again is very different across Europe. Is there something that you would say we could learn from that, or we could strive to more convergence also in that respect? Is that valuable, or would you say, well, tomorrow we will be having 1.5 meter society again in the Netherlands, let's vaccinate here first and see what happens next?
And maybe some nuance about the divergence after the emergency authorizations were granted, because it seems as if I showed one slide, above 55, below 55, 65, it was different in every single member state. But if you think about the fact that thanks to the joint procurement, that within a couple of weeks, every single member state and people in member states had access to these vaccines without any discussions about pricing, that was all done on a central level, that's quite amazing. And that is something to be very proud of as well as a European citizen. That does not mean automatically then every single step thereafter will be converged as well, because at a certain moment then unexpected things, well, you could say expected things come up, side effects always happen, but then politics start playing a role, and then you see divergence again. And if we could limit that a little bit more by having, even in the face of unexpected, expected side effects or perceived efficacy, if we then could have that same beacon of working together, like we do with procurement, then maybe conversions could go all the way along.
Bert, if we are really in troubles, we always look at you. Oh, we have to wait 30 seconds. But could you reflect on that, especially that safety comes up, divergence response from different countries? How can we work with that?
Well, thank you, Peter, for this question. I was very much impressed by this whole meeting because it learned me a lot in terms of where we come from. As Tony said, the whole system is built over the last 4 or 5 decades. So what we see today is the result of all these policies, regulations, and so on. But I was also impressed by what Bernard Steunenberg brought to the table, that we see all kinds of dynamics that is also seen in other areas as well. And I was impressed not only by the examples, but also the learnings we could take from there to our own field. And when I put my hat on from the regulatory science perspective, I particularly look also at the methodologies here. How can we measure? And I think we can measure dynamics over time, because what have been seen 10, 15 years ago is maybe different now, and can we explain what we see? We have very nice data from Delphi and Wim and other people, so that is going on, etc. But I think also to put these quantitative data into the perspective of the policy and regulation dynamics, as for instance Bernard, but also all our colleagues brought to the table. I think that is something that is of utmost importance for the regulatory science network, not only to understand what we see, but also to take learnings from there to improve the system as it is, and particularly the input from the patients was very helpful there. The eculizumab example we heard from the Nijmegen and the patient group is not only important for the patient group itself, but also what does it mean in adjusting dosing after the marketing? Because as Tony said, benefit risk decision of advice from the recommendation from the CHMP is not the end, but the beginning. And we are talking now about, how can we shape the beginning for the future from a scientific point of view.
Thank you, Bert. Any reflections immediately, or otherwise I would like to go to Sini to have a short statement on what you view on convergence and divergence in the European medicines regulation system.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much. My pleasure to join this. It's been really interesting indeed to hear all the different perspectives and all the different stakeholders, which is, of course, the biggest value. From an innovative industry point of view, the harmonization and convergence of the regulatory requirements is truly prerequisite. We would say it really allows that greater collaboration and work sharing between the authorities and provides also for the medicine developers and manufacturers predictability and saves the scarce resources when pulling together applications and following the guidances that are there. And a few clear positive examples are the work done in ICH, which is a fantastic tool to really strive for that international regulatory convergence. And just a recent study that was done to look at in total 63 ICH guidelines that were reviewed and looked at how well they've been implemented. There is truly a strong level of implementation and adherence across the agencies, and also the perception of the industry who then in practice faces these guidance to guide their work, also confirmed that it truly strives that harmonization. Another positive example that came in the last speech a little bit is how can we use the mutual recognition agreements as well in a way to strive the convergence. And regulatory convergence is actually a big part of what, for instance, trade associations look at when we contribute and give input to free trade agreements. Maybe the current example is the MRA between EU and US on the GMB inspections and batch certification, both for veterinary and human medicine, that was considered by our members particularly successful and saving resources. On the two examples that were discussed earlier today, which are unfortunately more than onto the side of divergence and what that then causes for the medicine developers. On the ATMPs, we've been calling quite a few years the Commission and Member States to improve transparency on these hospital exemptions that take place on a national level, and that divergence in their use create parallel paths to market access for the ATMPs, and it results in uncertainty and barriers to access to a certain extent, and lack of transparency of what is actually available where, and reduce incentives also to a certain extent for developing ATMPs in the EU, because you really don't know if it comes from the private sector, how is the uptake then. On the HTA, unfortunately, innovative industry particularly has been disappointed on that compromise regulation that comes there, and we have been supporting strongly a system that pool resources and a high level of expertise so that the medicines can be assessed jointly on the basis of clinical evidence, and that the joint early scientific dialogue can take place with the HTA agencies, and then to see quite big compromises to take on the terms of not finding an agreement on a political level between the countries is not good. And we know already up front that no matter how it's implemented, there is already this predicament for divergence. So it is quite a challenge for us all to tackle.
Thanks, Sini. Let me pick up on the convergence first. Tony, Sini spoke about the ICH guidances being relatively well implemented in a number of settings. Could you speak to also that ICH is obviously expanding at the moment? Is that leading to more convergence, would you say, or would that lead also to, at first, maybe struggles in how guidelines will progress, because the group is much bigger?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question, and honestly, I don't think we have the jury is still out on that one, because indeed it's enlarged from what was essentially a troika of Japan, US, and Europe, and now it's an absolutely multipolar, with players like China and the big players like India joining sort of that sort of scheme, and that's a good thing in terms of sort of global standards, if you believe in global development, and all of that then should actually enable global access conceptually. But I mean, the economics is always going to be the barrier behind that. But whether or not it's got, there always seems to be a reciprocal relationship with size increase with regards to efficiency. So if you want to go deeper, faster, you tend not to accumulate more partners in any endeavor. And that, I think, it's a fair challenge with regards to the ICH, comparing where it's at now versus where it came from historically. What's its efficiency with regards to any new further harmonization that's there. Having said that, I think the governance extension has been navigated through in the last couple of years, and there's a fresh program now, and I think people, and maybe COVID is going to act as an accelerator or a catalyst indeed to that with regards to more ambitious sort of guidance developments on topics that will be considered mature to go into an ICH process. So yeah, I mean, but honestly, to sort of say, can I guarantee that it's as good or as efficient as it has been historically? It's too early to say that yet.
Okay. Can I chip in briefly on vaccines here?
Sure. Yeah.
For me, it was quite amazing to see that the vaccines approved in China are not approved in Europe, and the other way around. The vaccines we have here are not approved in China. AstraZeneca is still not approved in the United States. So in terms of hoping that COVID-19 will bring us closer in terms of ICH, I have my doubts there, actually. Politics play too great a role.
Yeah, but can I just respond?
Sure.
In order to approve something, somebody's got to file the dossier.
That's the first one, yeah, I agree.
You know, it's a sort of sine qua non. You know, but you're absolutely right. If you look at that, and I think if you do the history on the current pandemic, you will see the differential filing patterns, what went on in the States, and indeed what their procurement was. And I do think the vaccine market per se is a highly atypical market, and it's one where the government and the manufacturer have got this compact, and it's not just a pandemic feature, it's a historical feature, and even with regards to liability, etc., that is a very atypical market as opposed to what I would call mainstream pharmaceuticals. So, but the differential filing pattern is interesting, no doubt.
It was not criticism against EMA.
No. Very interesting. It's a very interesting question, and it's asked by people also. I watch sometimes these discussion programs in the evening, and people ask why do the FDA and EMA and the MHRA have to take a decision on this? Why isn't there a global alliance? And I think maybe we should ask it to Bernard Steunenberg more. Why isn't that there yet? Because I think obviously the highest level of convergence would be that we say, well, maybe we can go together. But I think it's a step too far.
I know, but Peter, in the current, we had the Access initiative where we had a number of third-party non-EU regulators actually, piggyback on the centralized review that we were doing with the current pandemic, and I think that's been appreciated. It had no obligatory mutual recognition, unilateral recognition, but it was certainly saying the process is open to all to at least join and participate in, and if they want to benefit from an approval, that has actually resulted. But it certainly wasn't at the global level. But can I just on the global, I mean, there was mention of the mutual, I think Cindy said the mutual recognition on the manufacturing front, GMP, isn't that a great start? But they exclude biologicals, so you would sort of think the first world Europe and the first world America, surely we should be able to recognize each other's inspection standards to include biologicals, and therein lies the rub maybe, and often those mutual recognition agreements are not standalone negotiations, they're often tacked on to bigger, economic treaty negotiations, and depending on whether those go ahead or not, you can then have an MRA. But I mean, conceptually, in a sort of global supply situation, we do need those mutual recognitions because none of us have got the resource to do all of it, in isolation. So that it just is not possible. So instead of us sending inspectors to the States and vice versa to Europe, maybe we're better off sending them to China and India, where most of our pharmaceuticals, APIs and generics, etc., come from, and that actually is better in terms of a global investment in quality assurance. No?
Absolutely. Larissa, a final question to you before I go back to Bert Leufkens to actually already conclude our discussion, is you're obviously having a rare disease. We heard earlier Wim Altena saying, well, it's nice that we can do a study, but all these academics are sitting on their own data and they don't want to share that. How can we make that converge? Because I think especially from learning after drugs are approved, especially in this setting, we need to have these data collection in registries, for instance, and it doesn't work if everybody does that in isolation.
Yeah. Well, actually, there have also been discussions of patients owning their own data. And I am actually not quite against it, if you can organize that. And in that sense, you can also then, as a patient, be empowered to say, okay, this can be used by different pharmaceutical companies or other parties, academics, to dig further into the disease or... I'm largely in favor of biobanks and registries, to also get the picture of the background disease and then be able to share that amongst different parties to do their best. And of course, I cannot speak about data that are in the hands of the different pharmaceutical companies, but the vaccine exercise showed us that more data sharing and expertise sharing speeds up the process and is in the benefit of patients in the end. So
I think Tony at the break told me about the transparency initiative of sharing this raw data, or at least the data of the trials more through the EMA side when you already have approved a medicine. So I think that is something that we all probably could benefit from reusing that patient data that is available and that has been there generated by patients for a drug to understand how it works. So I think we all are probably able to learn more from that. I think we have to go. Yeah, unfortunately, it's already 5:30, and we will be locked up either here till tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, I guess, or thrown out of the building. I don't know in what way, but we have to go back to you, Bert, to conclude today's discussions. So, Bert, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, colleagues, for this, I think, very inspiring workshop again. Actually, this whole topic about upstream and downstream convergence was at the agenda of the Regulatory Science Network for many months, and we went forward and backwards. And I have to say, there is some bias here, because as the discussion also today showed that while we had problems with the downstream lack of convergence, and we said, well, we celebrate the convergence for upstream. But Tony and I think also Bernard showed us that it's not always 100% upstream convergence, and we have many examples of that. But adaptation at local situation is, of course, not always bad news, as we have seen with the AMR, but also adaptation to local clinical cultures, expectations of patients. So it's not only bad news. And I think that the whole discussions within the Regulatory Science Network actually started, and I think Hans alluded to that, when we saw that vaccines with a European license had different appreciations among European member states, very often for logical reasons, etc., and interpretation of the data and local situations. But that was not only a question of differences in access, as for instance, as Wim showed us. It was also an issue of how does it affect trust in not only the vaccines, but also how does it affect the trust in the whole system. When you see that authorities in Denmark have a different views compared to France or to the Netherlands and so on. And I think this is unfinished business, and I'm very happy that the Regulatory Science Network and with colleagues here in the room, either physically but also digitally, are also helping us to bring this theme forward, because it's a team, as also Sini said. It's something also when you work as a company and you have developed your product over the many years, and then finally you have a license, then it can go everywhere. And it was also Sjaak in his introduction that highlighted it. And that was something I really learned from this workshop, that how can we articulate the issues. It's not only bad news, but also to learn from, we come from far. The current situation is sometimes very critical, particularly when it comes to differences in access. And when I put up my head as a scientist, as I said before, scientists, they love variance. So the more variance, the more to measure, the more to research. But I think from the policy perspective, but also from the public health perspective, I hope that this workshop also brings us forward in terms of sensitivity for the issue, but also to invest in more studies, more learnings, but also to have a view for the other disciplines, as Bernard showed us. It's not only regulatory science people, we need also the legal people, the social scientists, because to understand how this works on a national, a European, but also on a global level is important also to serve our patients and our local communities in the best ways. So having said that from the contents point of view, I'm very happy that we could organize as a regulatory science network this workshop. I would like to thank, of course, Robin and team, because he did a superb job to be very flexible in terms of physically and digitally, etc. And I would also like to thank Sjaak and of course also Peter this for superb sharing all the sessions and be flexible forward, backwards. I understand there are some little gifts for the speakers and the panelists, so that will be handled by Robin and team. But overall, please be linked to the Regulatory Science Network, and if you have any questions or comments or feedbacks, etc., please join us in this conversation, because we very welcome also for future discussions and future suggestions also for our program. So having said that, I close formally this workshop, and we hope, of course, next year that we are in a more physical and that we also can serve Tony not only with a cheese sandwich but also with a decent beer. So thank you.
Decently sized also. All right. Sjaak, do you want to say some final words, final words, or?
No. Well, actually, Bert said it all. So I wanted to thank you for coming over, either here live, either by the live stream. I think it was a difficult decision to choose between this hybrid setup and totally virtual. That was a decision of the last few days. So I think I'm pleased that we made the decision, and this was a nice mixture. I want to thank the technical crew, Heuvelman, for making this possible with a very good quality of the panel discussion. A hybrid panel discussion, I think it worked very well, at least that's my view. So thank you for coming. You have 20 minutes to chit-chat and then make sure you're outside, and hope to see you next time on an RSNN meeting. And as Bert said, hopefully fully physical. Thank you very much and have a safe trip.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.